Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. We counted 5 rooms when the realtor showed us through. I remember because my wife made a joke about needing one for each purpose: bedroom, office, studio, gym, and guest room. The house felt perfect then, bathed in afternoon sunlight that poured through the western windows and painted everything in shades of amber and gold. The hallway stretched long and narrow, doors evenly spaced on both sides, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. Everything about it whispered possibility. The first night, we didn't notice. Exhaustion from moving had pulled us under before the clock struck 10, and we slept deeply in our new bedroom at the hall's far end. But the second night, when I rose to use the bathroom around 1 in the morning, I stood in that hallway and felt something wrong settle into my bones like winter cold. 6 doors. I counted them twice, running my fingertips along the wall as I moved, feeling the frames pass beneath my touch. 1, 2, 3 on the left, 1, 2, 3 on the right. 6 doors, when there should have been 5. The bathroom light hummed behind me, casting my shadow long and distorted down the corridor. I tried to remember the layout from the daytime. Our bedroom at the end, the office directly across, the studio, guest room, and gym completing the set. 5 rooms, 5 doors. But now, between the office and what should have been the studio, another door stood where none had been before. The wood looked darker than the others, as though stained by time or smoke. No handle caught the light, just a smooth surface broken only by a small keyhole near where a knob should be. I approached it slowly, my bare feet silent on the cool floor. The air around it felt different, denser somehow, pressing against my skin with an almost physical weight. I reached out to touch it, but my wife's voice stopped me from the bedroom. She asked if I was all right, her words thick with sleep. I told her yes. Everything was fine, just getting water. When I turned back to look at the door, I couldn't be certain in the dim light exactly which one had seemed wrong. They all looked the same now, pale wood with brass handles gleaming faintly in the darkness. The next morning I counted again. 5 doors. The hallway stretched exactly as it had during our walkthrough, logical and ordinary in the clean light streaming through the window at the corridor's end. I stood there holding my coffee, feeling foolish and disoriented, wondering if I'd been sleepwalking or still half caught in a dream. But I knew what I'd seen. The certainty of it had settled somewhere beneath my ribcage, a small stone of knowledge I couldn't dislodge. I said nothing to my wife. What would I tell her? That our new home gained an extra room at night? That reality itself was misbehaving? She'd been stressed about the move, worried about starting her new job, adapting to the neighborhood. The last thing she needed was me adding phantom architecture to her concerns. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathing deepen into sleep beside me. The house settled around us with small sounds, the creak of cooling floorboards, the whisper of wind against windows, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. But beneath them, I imagined I could hear something else. A rhythm that didn't quite match the house's natural breathing. A presence waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. At 12:47 a.m. I rose and walked into the hallway. The 6th door was there. It stood between the office and studio, exactly where it had been before. In the darkness, it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the faint light from the street that filtered through the corridor window. I moved closer, and the air grew colder with each step, my breath beginning to mist before my face. The door had no handle, just that keyhole, small and dark and somehow watching. I knelt before it, my knees protesting against the hard floor, and leaned close. The smell hit me first, old paper and dust, copper and something else I couldn't name. Something organic and wrong. I pressed my eye to the keyhole. Darkness, complete and absolute, as though I were staring into the space between stars. But it wasn't empty. Something moved in that black, shifting in ways that hurt to perceive. shapes that folded in on themselves, angles that existed in more dimensions than my mind could process. And somewhere in that impossible geometry, I sensed awareness. Something knew I was looking. I jerked back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stumbled into the opposite wall. The hallway spun around me, and for a moment I couldn't remember which direction led back to the bedroom. Then my wife called my name, concerned, and the disorientation shattered. I rushed back to bed, mumbling something about checking a noise, and pulled the covers over myself like a child hiding from monsters. She asked if I was feeling all right. Her hand found mine beneath the blanket, warm and solid and real. I squeezed it perhaps too tightly and told her yes, just adjusting to the new place. She accepted this and drifted back to sleep. But I lay rigid until dawn began to gray the windows, listening for sounds from the hallway. The morning revealed 5 doors again, always 5 in the daylight. I began to mark them mentally, noting every detail, the grain patterns in the wood, the exact placement of the brass handles, the small scuff on the office door's lower left corner. But when night came, when the clock hands crept past midnight, a 6th door manifested between the office and studio, and none of my careful observations mattered. It simply existed, as solid and real as any other part of the house. I started staying up, watching for the moment of transition, but I never caught it. One moment, 5 doors stretched along the hallway's length. I'd blink or glance away or check my phone, and when I looked back, 6 doors waited in the darkness. The transformation happened in the gaps between my attention, in the spaces where certainty faltered. My wife began to notice my fatigue. Dark circles had carved themselves beneath my eyes, and I'd grown jumpy, startling at ordinary sounds. She suggested maybe the move had been more stressful than I'd admitted, that perhaps I should take a few days off work, see a doctor about the insomnia. I agreed to think about it, knowing I wouldn't. How could I explain that I was keeping vigil against a door that existed only in darkness? 3 weeks into living in the house, I found marks on the door's surface. Scratches, thin and deep, scoring the wood in parallel lines. They started near the top and dragged downward, as though something had raked claws against the inside of the door, trying to get out. The scratches hadn't been there the night before. I'd checked, running my hands over the smooth surface. But now they marked the wood in sets of 4, overlapping and frantic. The keyhole seemed larger too, or perhaps that was just my imagination. I couldn't stop myself from looking through it again. The darkness beyond had changed. It moved with more purpose now, shapes coalescing and dispersing like oil on water. And the awareness had grown stronger. I could feel it focused on me, patient and hungry and vast. Whatever existed beyond that door wanted something. Wanted out, wanted in, wanted. I tried to tell my wife. Over breakfast, with sunlight making everything seem safe and rational, I tried to explain about the 6th door. The words came out wrong, tangled and paranoid. She listened with growing concern, then gently suggested that maybe I should talk to someone, a professional. The stress, she said, the new environment, lack of sleep. It could make anyone see things that weren't there. But they were there. I knew they were there. And her inability to see them only isolated me further, pushing me into a space where I couldn't trust my own perceptions or anyone else's assurances. I began to research the house's history. The county records showed it had been built in 1987, nothing unusual about its construction or past owners. No deaths, no tragedies, no reason for it to be anything other than what it appeared. But I found a mention in an old forum post about the neighborhood, someone asking if anyone else had noticed strange things about houses on our street. The thread had gone nowhere, just a few dismissive replies and then silence. The original poster never followed up. The scratches on the door multiplied. Each night, more appeared, scoring deeper into the wood. I started to hear sounds from behind it. Not loud, just soft movements that might have been branches scraping the exterior wall or might have been something else entirely. A whisper of fabric, a gentle thud, like something pressing against the other side. The breathing of something that shouldn't breathe. I wanted to leave, pack everything, tell my wife we'd made a mistake, find somewhere else. But how could I explain? And worse, part of me had become fascinated. The door was impossible, and I needed to understand it. Needed to know what lay beyond it, what wanted so desperately to cross that threshold. On the 1-month anniversary of moving in, I found the key. It lay on the hallway floor directly in front of the 6th door, as though someone had slipped it underneath from the other side. Small and black, made of metal that felt wrong to the touch. Too cold, too smooth, slightly oily. I picked it up and it seemed to pulse in my palm, warm and alive and eager. My wife had gone to visit her mother for the weekend. I was alone in the house, alone with the door and the key, and a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. Every rational thought screamed at me to throw the key away, leave the house, never come back. But rationality had become a thin veneer over something much older and darker. Curiosity, obsession, the human need to know even when knowing might destroy us. I waited until after midnight. The door appeared right on schedule, materializing between heartbeats. The scratches covered almost its entire surface now, deep gouges that had split the wood in places. Through the gaps, I could see darkness, absolute and waiting. I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that echoed down the hallway like a gunshot. The door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but black. No room beyond, no floor or walls or ceiling, just void, stretching backward into infinity. And from that void, something began to emerge. I saw it in fragments, a suggestion of form, pieces that assembled and disassembled in my peripheral vision. It moved like smoke but had weight, like shadow but cast light, like nothing that should exist in the world I knew. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the hallway walls, and my breath came in ragged clouds. It reached the threshold. I could feel its intention, its desperate need to cross over into my reality. And I knew, with sudden terrible clarity, that if I let it through, nothing would ever be right again. Not in this house, not in this world. Some barriers existed for reasons beyond human understanding, and I had just opened one. I slammed the door shut. The key burned in my hand and I threw it away, heard it skitter across the floor, but the door remained. And behind it, I could sense frustration and rage, and an intelligence that had existed long before humanity crawled from the oceans. The scratching started immediately, violent and loud, wood splintering under invisible assault. The door bucked in its frame, hinges groaning. I backed away, unsure what to do, how to fight something that shouldn't exist. The hallway lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness broken only by pale moonlight. And then my phone rang. My wife, calling to say goodnight, her voice cheerful and normal and belonging to a world that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. I answered, and as I spoke to her, the scratching stopped. The door stood still. In the silence that followed, I could hear only my own heartbeat and her voice asking if I was okay, if everything was all right at the house. I told her yes. Everything was fine. I was just getting ready for bed. When I turned around, 5 doors lined the hallway. Just 5. The 6th had vanished as completely as though it had never existed. The walls showed no scars where it had been, no evidence of its presence. The key had disappeared as well, leaving not even a scratch on the floor where it had fallen. I moved through the house in a daze, checking every room, every window, every lock. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd done. The door was real. The thing beyond it was real. And just because I couldn't see them now, didn't mean they had ceased to exist. My wife came home the next evening. She found me sitting in the hallway watching the walls. She asked what I was doing, and I couldn't answer. How could I explain that I was waiting? That I'd opened something that wouldn't stay closed? That somewhere in the space between what we can see and what we know must be there, a door exists that only appears after midnight, and something behind it has learned that we're here. She led me to bed, worried and gentle, talking about scheduling a doctor's appointment. I let her guide me, nodding at appropriate moments. But my mind remained in that hallway, waiting, watching, knowing. Because tonight, as I lie here in the darkness, I can hear it. Soft at first, then growing louder. The sound of something scratching at a door that doesn't exist. The sound of something patient and hungry, working at a barrier that grows thinner with each passing night. And I can't help but wonder, when that door finally opens on its own, when whatever lives beyond it forces its way through, will anyone else be able to see it? Or will I face it alone, trapped in a reality only I can perceive, unable to convince anyone that the danger is real until it's far too late? The scratching continues. I count the doors in my mind. 5. Always 5 in the daylight. But midnight is coming again, and with it, the 6th door will return. And this time, I don't think I'll be able to keep it closed. Story 2. The house smelled of dust and decades when I first stepped inside. My uncle's estate, a Victorian relic tucked into the woods of northern Vermont, its bones creaking with age and neglect. I hadn't expected to inherit anything from him. We'd spoken maybe twice in my entire life, distant conversations at family funerals where he'd stood apart, watching everyone with those pale, calculating eyes. But here I was, sole beneficiary to a house I'd never seen, in a town I'd never visited. The lawyer had been brief during our phone call. No mortgage, no debts, just the property and whatever remained inside. He'd suggested I come take a look before deciding whether to sell. Something in his voice had seemed off, a hesitation that lingered in the pauses between his words, but I'd attributed it to small-town strangeness. The staircase dominated the front hall, 13 steps of dark wood ascending into shadow, the banister smooth and cold beneath my palm. The portrait hung at eye level on the wall alongside the 7th step, positioned so anyone climbing or descending would pass directly before it. An old photograph in an ornate silver frame, the kind that suggested it had been expensive once, important. At first I barely registered what I was seeing. Just another relic of my uncle's life, a sepia-toned image of a man in early 20th century clothing, standing at the bottom of what appeared to be these very stairs. The photograph had that distinctive quality of old pictures, the subject frozen mid-movement, his features slightly blurred as though he'd shifted during the long exposure. His suit was dark, his face obscured by the photograph's age and damage. Nothing remarkable, really. I spent the first day inventorying rooms, sorting through decades of accumulated existence. My uncle had lived simply, it seemed. Few personal effects, sparse furniture, everything arranged with an almost military precision. The only exception was his study, where journals filled an entire bookshelf. I'd meant to read them, to understand something about the man whose house I'd inherited. But every time I opened one, the handwriting swam before my eyes. Tight, cramped script that seemed to compress more words into each line than should be possible. That night, I slept in the master bedroom. The mattress was old but serviceable, and exhaustion pulled me under despite the house's unfamiliar sounds, the settling of old timber, the scratch of branches against windows, the distant drip of water somewhere in the walls. I dreamed of climbing stairs that never ended, each step taking me higher into darkness that pressed against my skin like cold water. The second morning, I passed the portrait again on my way down to make coffee. Sunlight slanted through the landing window, illuminating the photograph with unusual clarity. The man in the image stood at the bottom of the staircase, his foot positioned as if preparing to climb. One hand gripped the banister. The angle of his head suggested he was looking up, though his features remained indistinct, eaten away by time or damage to the original print. Something about his posture felt expectant. I dismissed the thought, chalked it up to the house's oppressive atmosphere and my own fatigue. The coffee maker, an ancient percolator that took 20 minutes to brew, gave me time to explore the kitchen. Here, too, everything was organized with unsettling precision. Canned goods arranged by size and type, utensils sorted in drawers with military exactness. Even the dish towels were folded into perfect rectangles. The journals called to me from the study. I spent most of that day attempting to decipher my uncle's handwriting, making little progress. The entries seemed to be observations, notes about the house, the property, the surrounding woods. Nothing personal, no emotions or reflections. Just data, recorded with the detachment of a scientist documenting an experiment. One passage I managed to decode mentioned the subject and progressive manifestation, but the context remained opaque. Evening came early, shadows pooling in corners before 4 o'clock. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, my hand trailing along the banister, and stopped without meaning to in front of the portrait. The light was different now, dimmer, but somehow the photograph seemed clearer than it had that morning. The man had moved up one step. His foot was planted on the first stair, his body angled upward. That blurred face now turned more directly toward the camera, or toward whoever stood looking at him. My breath caught. I leaned closer, studying the image with sudden intensity. The figure occupied a different position than I remembered from yesterday. Definitely different. I could see it clearly. The first step instead of the ground level. But that was impossible. Photographs didn't change. The image was fixed, permanent, a moment frozen forever, unless I'd simply misremembered. It had been dark when I'd first arrived, and I'd been tired, not paying close attention. The mind played tricks under such circumstances. Memory was unreliable, especially when exhausted. I must have glanced at it quickly, registered an impression without really looking. Now I was seeing it properly, that was all. I continued upstairs, but sleep came slowly. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, every shadow pregnant with possibility. I found myself listening for footsteps, though I knew I was alone. The bedroom door had no lock, something I hadn't noticed before, and it hung slightly ajar no matter how firmly I closed it, as though the frame had warped over the years. The third day, I approached the portrait with deliberate focus. Morning light filled the stairwell, eliminating any possibility of tricks of shadow or perspective. The man now stood 2 steps up. His posture had straightened, his head tilted at a different angle. That obscured face seemed to be looking higher, following the trajectory of his climb. One hand still gripped the banister, but the other had moved to his side, fingers spread as if for balance. No misremembering this time. No exhaustion-induced confusion. The image had changed. Was changing. Each day the figure ascended another step. I spent an hour examining the frame, searching for any mechanism that might explain it. Some kind of trick photography, perhaps, or a series of images that cycled through. But the frame was solid silver, no moving parts, no hidden displays, just glass and wood backing and the photograph itself, mounted on aging paper that showed every sign of being a genuine antique. The journals, my uncle's obsessive documentation. There had to be an explanation there. I returned to the study and attacked the handwriting with renewed determination, forcing myself to parse each cramped line. Gradually, patterns emerged from the chaos of script. He'd been tracking something, measuring it. The word ascension appeared repeatedly, always underlined. References to the previous occupant and transference of presence. Notes about photographs and moments and the permeability of fixed images. One passage chilled me. The subject demonstrates consistent progression. 1 step per day, regardless of observation. The terminus approaches. Previous attempts at removal resulted in complications. The frame must remain in place. The house requires completion. I read it 3 times, each word settling into my consciousness like stones dropping into dark water. Previous attempts at removal, complications. The house requires completion. 13 steps on the staircase. The figure had started at the bottom. 2 days ago, he'd been on the 2nd step. Yesterday, the 3rd. This morning, the 4th. Simple mathematics suggested he would reach the 13th step, the landing where I stood to view the portrait, in 9 more days. And then what? The question haunted me as I moved through the house, trying to occupy myself with practical tasks. Cleaning, sorting, taking inventory for the eventual sale. But I found myself checking the portrait every few hours, watching for movement even though logic insisted photographs didn't work that way. The figure remained static each time I looked, frozen mid-climb, yet every morning revealed him one step higher. The nights grew worse. I'd wake to sounds I couldn't identify. Not quite footsteps, but something rhythmic, deliberate. A slow, steady progression that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The bedroom door continued its habit of drifting open, and I'd lie in the darkness staring at the rectangle of lesser black beyond, convinced something stood in the hallway, watching. I considered leaving. The house could rot for all I cared. Whatever my uncle had left me, it wasn't worth this creeping dread that had settled into my bones. But something kept me there. Curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to be driven out by my own paranoia. Or maybe something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge, a compulsion that felt less like choice and more like obligation. The figure reached the 7th step, halfway. The photograph hung beside him now, meaning he stood exactly where the frame was mounted. I realized with a jolt that if the pattern continued, he would eventually climb past the portrait's position, would be above it, looking down. The geometry felt wrong, impossible. He was climbing stairs within a photograph of stairs while hanging on those same stairs. A loop of ascending that defied spatial logic. My uncle's journals offered no comfort. The later entries grew increasingly abstract, the handwriting deteriorating into something barely legible. Words like emergence and manifestation appeared alongside stranger phrases. The threshold of persistence, image made ambulatory, the weight of presence exceeding its container. In one of the final entries, written in shaking script that suggested either terror or excitement, he'd noted, 3 steps remaining. The subject demonstrates awareness. Eye contact confirmed. Recommendations for successor. Do not remove the frame. Do not damage the photograph. Do not be present at completion. I stopped reading. My hands trembled as I closed the journal, setting it carefully back on the shelf as if it might detonate. Recommendations for successor. He'd known someone would inherit the house, had known what they would find, had left instructions, warnings veiled in the language of observation and documentation. Do not be present at completion. The figure stood on the 10th step now. His features had grown clearer with each day's ascension, as though proximity to the frame's edge brought him into sharper focus. I could make out details I'd never noticed before. The texture of his suit, the buttons on his vest, the way his hair was parted. But his face remained frustratingly obscure, a blur that my eyes couldn't quite resolve no matter how closely I looked. 3 steps remaining. My uncle's final note. 3 steps until the figure reached the top, until he stood on the landing where the stairs terminated. Until he reached the same physical space where I stood to observe him. I should have left then, should have walked away and never looked back. But I found myself rooted to the routine now, each morning climbing the stairs to witness his progress. It had become ritual, compulsion, something beyond conscious choice. The house seemed to hum with anticipation, the walls holding their breath, every shadow watching and waiting. The 11th step. 2 days remained. The figure's posture had changed subtly. Before, he'd been climbing, focused on the ascent itself. Now he seemed poised, ready. His weight shifted forward as though preparing to crest the final rise. That obscured face had tilted upward, and I had the irrational certainty that he was looking directly at me, that he had always been looking at me, that the blur wasn't damage to the photograph but something far worse. A face that existed in between moments, not quite resolved, not quite present. I spent that day trying to decipher the absolute final entry in my uncle's journal, written in such haste that the ink smeared across the page. I could only make out fragments. Cannot escape the frame. Every photograph a window. We are all ascending toward. The moment we stepped inside was the moment we... The sentence cut off mid-thought. The journal ended there. The remaining pages blank. I searched for more. Found nothing. Whatever my uncle had wanted to say, whatever conclusion he'd reached, he'd either taken it with him or left it unwritten. The 12th step. Tomorrow, the figure would reach the top. Tomorrow, completion would arrive. I stood before the portrait for a long time that night, studying every detail by the light of the hall sconce. The man looked almost real now, substantial, as though depth had entered the photograph. His suit had texture. His hand on the banister showed individual fingers. His posture conveyed weight and intention. Only his face remained that terrible blur, a smudge where features should be. And as I stared at it, I realized I could almost see something emerging from the obscurity. The suggestion of eyes, the hint of a mouth. The shape of the face was familiar. Bone structure I recognized. The angle of the jaw. I forced myself to look away, to climb the stairs to the bedroom, to try to sleep. But I lay awake in the darkness, listening to the house breathe around me, feeling the portrait's presence below like a weight pulling at the floor. Sometime deep in the night, I heard it clearly, the sound I'd been half hearing for days. A footstep. Just one, slow and deliberate. The creak of a stair bearing weight. Morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. I descended with my heart hammering, knowing what I would find, and dreading it anyway. The figure stood on the 13th step, the landing itself. He'd reached the top. The ascension was complete, but that wasn't the worst of it. The photograph's perspective had changed. The man no longer looked up toward the camera. Instead, he looked out, his body angled toward the viewer and his face. God. His face was finally clear, no longer obscured, no longer blurred into anonymity. I saw every detail with terrible precision. It was my face, not my uncle's, not some previous occupant. Mine. The suit was different, the hair styled wrong, but the features were unmistakable. I was looking at myself looking back at me. I reached for the frame with shaking hands, intending to tear it down, to smash it, to end whatever was happening. But I stopped. The figure in the photograph was reaching too, mirror-like, his hand extending toward the glass from inside. Our fingers drew closer, separated only by the thin barrier of the frame. Somewhere behind me, I heard it. The click of a camera's shutter. That old sound, mechanical and final. The sound of a moment being captured, fixed, preserved. I turned, but the stairwell was empty. Just me and the portrait, and the house, holding its breath. When I looked back at the photograph, I saw what I hadn't noticed before. In the background, barely visible in the sepia shadows, there was another frame hanging on the wall. Another portrait. And in that portrait, dimly, I could make out a figure standing at the bottom of a staircase, face obscured, preparing to climb. My legs felt weak. I sat on the top step, the 13th step, and stared at the portrait. At myself. The figure in the frame hadn't moved further, but he didn't need to. He'd reached the top. He'd completed his ascension. And now he stood exactly where I sat, occupying the same space, separated only by the boundary between image and reality. I understood then what my uncle had tried to document, what he'd spent years observing. The house didn't just contain the portrait contained the house. Contained us, every occupant who'd climbed these stairs, who'd passed this frame, who'd looked too long at the figure ascending. We were all in there, somewhere, climbing toward a completion that wasn't an ending, but a transition. The portrait showed me at the top of the stairs, but I was sitting at the top of the stairs, which meant the photograph was showing the present, not the past, which meant I looked down at my hands, at the clothes I was wearing. A suit, dark, old-fashioned. When had I changed? I couldn't remember. The details felt slippery, uncertain. Had I been wearing this all along? Had I always been wearing this? The house seemed brighter suddenly, or maybe my vision had adjusted. I stood and turned, looking back up the stairwell. Except there was no up anymore. Just the 13 steps descending into the hall below. The perspective had inverted, or I had inverted, or something fundamental about direction had shifted. I started down the stairs, one step at a time, slow and deliberate. I could see the frame hanging beside me as I descended, and I wondered what the portrait showed now. Wondered if someone was looking at it, watching a figure climb down instead of up. wondered if they understood yet what was happening. My hand trailed along the banister. The wood felt smooth, cool, more solid than anything I could remember touching. Each step took me further from the landing, further into the house, deeper into whatever I'd become. Behind me, I heard another sound. Not a camera this time, but a door opening. The front door, I thought. Someone entering. Someone new. I should warn them. Should call out. But my throat had closed, or maybe I no longer had the right kind of voice for that. Instead, I continued my descent, moving from the 13th step to the 12th to the 11th, feeling myself compress somehow, feeling dimension fold away like excess fabric. By the time I reached the 7th step, the one beside the frame, I could see my reflection in the glass. Or not a reflection. Something else. A presence. An image. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll be on the 6th step, and the day after, the 5th. And eventually, I'll reach the bottom and stand there with my foot poised to climb, looking up at whoever comes to inherit this house, this portrait, this endless ascension that is also a descent that is also neither and both. The house requires completion, my uncle had written. Now I understand. Completion isn't an ending. It's a cycle. A loop of moments captured and contained, each occupant adding another layer to the frame, another figure to the infinite background of portraits containing portraits. I am the photograph now. Or the photograph is me. The distinction has become meaningless, blurred like a face caught mid-exposure. All that remains is the movement, the progression, the slow and steady count of 13 steps that never truly ends, because every ending is another beginning, every arrival a departure, every frame containing another frame, ascending and descending through time, that has become as flat and fixed as sepia tone on aging paper. The new occupant will find me here. They'll pass this frame every day, climbing up to their bedroom, descending to their breakfast. They'll notice me eventually, a figure on the stairs, moving 1 step per day. At first, they won't believe it. They'll rationalize, dismiss, forget. But eventually, they'll understand. They'll read the journals. They'll count the steps. And when I reach the top, when I stand on the 13th step once more, they'll be there, looking at me, seeing their own face reflected in mine, separated only by glass and the thin, permeable boundary between where they stand and where I stand. 3 steps remaining, I think, though I'm not sure anymore if I'm climbing or falling, ascending or being pulled down into the frame's silver embrace. 3 steps until everything completes and begins again. The house creaks. Someone is climbing the stairs behind me. I don't turn to look. Story 3. The attorney's letter arrived on a Tuesday, informing me that my uncle had left me his estate. A Victorian mansion I'd visited exactly once as a boy, decades ago. I remembered little beyond the smell of dust and the way shadows seemed to pool in corners even at noon. My wife thought we should sell it immediately, but I convinced her we should at least see the place first. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the vague sense that I owed something to the uncle I'd barely known. The house stood at the end of a tree-lined drive, 3 stories of weathered brick and dark windows that reflected nothing but clouds. As we approached, I noticed the peculiar silence. No birds, no rustle of leaves despite the wind I could see bending the branches. My wife touched my arm, a gesture I'd come to recognize as her way of saying she wanted to leave without actually saying it. Inside, the air tasted of copper and old paper. Every room we entered revealed the same strange phenomenon. The mirrors were cracked, not shattered, but fractured in precise, almost geometric patterns, as if something had struck each one at its exact center with surgical precision. The entrance hall mirror bore a web of fractures radiating from a point at eye level. The parlor mirrors showed similar damage. In the dining room, in the library, in the upstairs hallway, every single mirror displayed these deliberate wounds. My wife suggested vandals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else entirely. The cracks caught light oddly, creating small prisms that threw distorted rainbows across walls and floors. More unsettling was what they reflected. At first I thought my eyes were adjusting to the dim interior, but as I looked closer at the entrance hall mirror, I realized the reflection showed a subtly different version of the hallway behind me. The wallpaper pattern was reversed. A portrait that hung on the left wall in reality appeared on the right in the reflection. And the grandfather clock in the corner showed a different time than the one I could see when I turned around. I told myself it was an optical illusion created by the cracks, some trick of fractured light and unusual angles. But when I positioned myself directly in front of the mirror, examining my own reflection, I saw it clearly. In the background of the reversed hallway, a figure stood in shadow. Not my wife, who was exploring the parlor. Someone, or something else. I spun around. The hallway was empty. My wife called out, asking if I'd found anything interesting. Her voice sounded distant, muffled by the thick walls and heavy doors. I told her about the mirrors, describing them as damaged antiques, curiosities we might restore or replace. I didn't mention what I'd seen. There was no reason to worry her with what was obviously a trick of perception, a momentary confusion caused by the dim light and the disorienting cracks. We spent that first night in the master bedroom, despite my wife's protests that we should return to the hotel. I felt an inexplicable need to stay, to understand what was happening in this house. The bedroom mirror was the largest in the house, a massive gilt-framed piece that dominated the wall opposite the bed. Its cracks formed an intricate pattern, almost like a tree or a branching network of veins. In the reflection, the bedroom looked both familiar and wrong. The door was on the opposite wall. The window showed moonlight when the real window revealed only darkness. And in the darkest corner of the reflection, just beyond the reach of our bedside lamp, I thought I saw movement. Sleep came fitfully. I woke repeatedly, each time with the sensation that someone had just spoken my name. That breath had just touched my ear. My wife slept deeply, undisturbed by whatever was pressing against my consciousness. In the pre-dawn darkness, I found myself staring at the mirror, watching the reflected room, waiting for something I couldn't name. The cracks seemed to pulse with their own subtle luminescence, a faint glow that might have been moonlight, or might have been something else entirely. Morning brought no relief. In daylight, the house felt worse, the silence more oppressive, the shadows more deliberate in their placement. My wife suggested we at least catalog what was here before making any decisions about the property. We moved room by room, documenting furniture and artwork, making notes about repairs the house would need. And in every room, I found myself drawn to the mirrors, examining the cracks, studying what they reflected. The library mirror showed books on shelves that didn't exist in the real room. The kitchen mirror displayed a table set for dinner when the actual table was bare. The bathroom mirror on the second floor reflected a door I'd never seen in the actual bathroom. A door that, according to the reflection, should have led to another room, though the house's exterior dimensions suggested no such space could exist. By the third day, I'd begun to understand that each crack in each mirror opened onto a different version of the house. Not parallel universes in the science fiction sense, but permutations, places where small decisions had been made differently, where rooms had been built or demolished, where lives had taken alternate paths. The dining room mirror showed a table where someone had recently eaten, breadcrumbs still visible, wine glasses still full. The study mirror reflected papers scattered across the desk, fresh ink still wet on the pages. And in almost every reflection, if I looked carefully enough, I could see them. The watchers. They stood in doorways, in corners, in the spaces just beyond clear sight. Shapes that might have been people or might have been the house itself taking form, manifesting through the cracks in these broken surfaces. I tried to convince myself they were artifacts of the damaged glass, pareidolia, my mind constructing human forms from random patterns of light and shadow. But they moved. Subtly, incrementally, but they moved. Each time I glanced at a mirror and then looked back, they were closer, more defined, more present. My wife noticed my obsession with the mirrors. She asked if I was feeling well, if the house was affecting me somehow. I assured her I was fine, that I was simply fascinated by the damage, trying to understand what had caused it. But at night, alone in the dark while she slept, I stood before the mirrors and whispered to the figures I saw there, asking them what they wanted, who they were, why they watched. They never answered, but their presence intensified. I began to see them more clearly, faces pressed against the glass from the other side, hands raised as if testing the surface, mouths moving in speech I couldn't hear. In the parlor mirror, a man in old-fashioned clothes stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. In the upstairs hallway mirror, a woman in a dark dress seemed to pace back and forth, appearing and disappearing as she moved through the reflected space. And in the master bedroom mirror, in that corner where the light never quite reached, something waited. I couldn't see it clearly. The cracks distorted that section of the reflection into a maze of fractured images, but I could feel it watching. Whatever resided in that corner was more present than the others, more aware, more hungry. It knew I could see it. It knew I was beginning to understand. On the 7th night, I woke to find my wife standing before the bedroom mirror. She was motionless, her eyes fixed on her reflection, her breathing shallow and regular. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I got out of bed, approached her carefully, and touched her shoulder. She turned to me slowly, her eyes unfocused, her expression blank, and said something in a voice that wasn't quite hers. Something about the mirrors being doors, about the cracks being intentional, about what happens when you look too long at your own reflection and begin to see the spaces where other versions of yourself might exist. Then she blinked, confusion flooding her face, and asked why we were standing in front of the mirror in the middle of the night. She had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of what she'd said. I told her she must have been sleepwalking, that it was nothing to worry about. But I could see the fear in her eyes. She'd felt something, even if she couldn't remember it clearly. The presence of the watchers, the weight of their attention. The next morning, she insisted we leave. No more cataloging, no more assessment of the property. We would contact the attorney, arrange for the house to be sold as is, and never return. I agreed, of course. What else could I do? But as we packed our bags, as we prepared to abandon this inheritance, I felt a profound sense of loss, as if I were leaving behind something essential, some fundamental understanding of reality that the house had been trying to teach me. We loaded the car, locked the front door, and walked down the long driveway toward the main road. Neither of us looked back, though I wanted to. I wanted to see the house one more time, to memorize its dimensions and shadows, to fix in my mind the exact configuration of its windows and doors. But I kept walking, kept moving forward, and tried not to think about what I'd seen in those broken mirrors. 3 weeks later, I returned alone. I told myself I needed to retrieve some documents the attorney wanted, papers that had to do with the property transfer. But that was a lie. I returned because I couldn't stop thinking about the watchers, about the figures standing in those reflected spaces, about what they wanted, and why they'd been trying so hard to get my attention. I returned because in the days since we'd left, I'd begun to notice cracks appearing in other mirrors, in our bathroom at home, in shop windows I passed on the street, in the rearview mirror of my car. Small fractures, subtle damages that no one else seemed to see. And through those cracks, faint and distant but undeniably there, I saw them watching. The house welcomed me back with open doors and silent rooms. Dust had already begun to settle on surfaces, as if months had passed rather than weeks. I moved through the familiar spaces, greeting the mirrors like old friends, examining the reflected worlds they contained. The watchers were clearer now, more solid, more real. They no longer hid in shadows or stood at distant doorways. They pressed close to the glass, their features distinct, their expressions urgent. In the library, I saw myself, or a version of myself, standing in the reflected space, looking back at me with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He mouthed words I couldn't hear, gestured frantically, pointed at the cracks in the mirror as if they were a map or a message. In the parlor, multiple versions of the same face crowded against the glass, each one slightly different, each one trying to communicate something vital. I understood then what the house had been trying to tell me. The mirrors weren't just reflecting alternate versions of reality. They were showing me the truth. Every choice we make splinters us into countless variations, creating infinite versions of ourselves living infinite lives. The cracks in the mirrors were where these versions pressed close, where the barrier between what is and what might have been grew thin enough to see through. And the watchers, they were me, all of them. Every version of myself that existed in every possible configuration of reality. All of them aware, all of them conscious, all of them trying to reach across the fractures and touch the solid world I inhabited. Or perhaps I had it backwards. Perhaps I was the reflection, the watched rather than the watcher. Perhaps the version of myself standing in this dusty mansion, staring at broken mirrors, was just one more possibility, one more crack in the infinite glass, and the real me, the solid, actual me, was on the other side, looking back, wondering why this particular version had become so obsessed with things that existed only in reflection. I approached the master bedroom mirror, that massive gilt-framed piece with its intricate web of cracks. In the darkest corner of the reflection, the thing that had waited and watched for 7 nights was finally visible. It was me, of course, older, darker, hollowed out by years of standing in this reflected room, watching the solid world through fractured glass, waiting for the day when I would return and understand. It raised its hand. I raised mine. We pressed our palms against opposite sides of the glass, the cracks running between our fingers like veins, like connections, like the threads that bind every version of ourselves across every possible reality. The glass was warm, the cracks were spreading, and I couldn't quite recall which side of the mirror I'd started on when I first entered this house 7 nights ago. Or was it 7 weeks? 7 years? Time moved differently in reflection, fractured and non-linear, splitting at every point where choice branched reality into new configurations. I stood there, my hand against the warm glass, watching my reflection watch me back, and I realized I no longer knew if I was the man who'd inherited a mansion full of broken mirrors, or the reflection of a man who'd never left, who'd been standing here forever, watching the solid world with endless patience, waiting for the moment when the cracks would finally spread far enough to break down the barrier between what is and what might have been. Behind me, or was it in front of me, in the reflection, on the other side of the breaking glass? I heard my wife's voice calling my name. But when I turned to look, I saw only more mirrors, more cracks, more versions of this same room spreading out in infinite regression, each one containing a figure that might have been me, or might have been something wearing my face, all of them watching, all of them waiting, all of them pressing their hands against the glass. The cracks are spreading. I can feel them running through everything now, not just the mirrors, but the walls, the floor, the air itself. Reality is fracturing, splitting into all its possible versions at once, and I'm standing at the center, my hand still pressed to the warm glass, unable to remember which side I'm on, unable to tell if I'm reaching through or if something is reaching toward me. And in every crack, in every fracture, I see eyes looking back. My eyes, their eyes, our eyes, all of us watching, all of us waiting, all of us pressing against the breaking glass, hoping that when it finally shatters, we'll discover which version is real and which ones are just reflections, just possibilities, just cracks in the surface of a reality that might never have been solid to begin with. Story 4. The first time someone mentioned her, I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen. Mrs. Chen from next door had brought over a casserole, the neighborly gesture that small towns seem to require, and stood at my counter with her hands folded, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She said the neighborhood was quiet, that I'd like it here, that the previous owners had been lovely people. Then she paused, her fingers tightening against each other, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that sometimes late at night she saw a woman in white standing at my attic window. I laughed, told her the attic had been sealed since before I bought the place. The realtor had mentioned it, some structural issue decades ago, cheaper to just nail it shut than to renovate. I'd never even seen the door, assuming it was behind one of the walls the previous owners had put up during their various remodeling projects. Mrs. Chen didn't laugh. She nodded slowly, said she must have been mistaken, and left. I should have paid more attention to the way she hurried down my front steps. The house settled around me over the following weeks. I learned its sounds, the creak of floorboards in the hallway, the rattle of pipes when I ran the shower, the way wind whistled through some gap I hadn't found yet. Old houses talk to themselves. I'd lived in enough of them to know that, but this house seemed to have more to say than most. I worked from home, programming for a firm that didn't care where I was as long as the code was clean and the deadlines were met. It meant long hours in my study, headphones on, the world reduced to screens and logic, and the steady rhythm of typing. The isolation suited me, always had. But I started noticing things. The mailman, usually friendly, began leaving packages on the porch instead of knocking. The teenager who mowed lawns stopped meeting my eyes when I paid him, and more than once, I caught neighbors standing on the sidewalk, staring up at my house with expressions that made my stomach tighten. They were looking at the attic window. I started looking too. From the street, you could see it clearly. A small square window tucked under the eaves, the glass dusty and gray. Nothing remarkable about it, nothing that should draw anyone's attention. But once you knew people were looking, you couldn't help but look yourself. I never saw anything, just glass and darkness, and occasionally the reflection of clouds sliding past. The second person to mention her was Tom, who lived 3 houses down. He caught me getting my mail one Saturday morning, ambled over with his coffee and made small talk about the weather, about the upcoming block party, about everything except what he clearly wanted to say. Finally, he asked if I'd had any trouble with the attic. I told him the same thing I'd told Mrs. Chen: sealed, inaccessible, probably full of insulation and mouse droppings and nothing else. He nodded, sipped his coffee, and then mentioned in that same casual tone that he'd been up late the night before and had seen her again. The woman, in my attic window. Just standing there, he said, like she was watching the street. The coffee in his cup trembled slightly. I went inside and stood in my hallway, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where the attic access would be. The house's footprint was simple enough. 2 stories, straightforward layout. The attic should have been directly above my bedroom. But when I went upstairs and studied the walls, I couldn't find any door, any hatch, any indication that there was anything above me but roof. That night I lay in bed and listened. The house creaked and settled. Wind pushed against the windows. Somewhere, something dripped with metronomic persistence. And above me, I swore I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. The sound of someone pacing back and forth across a wooden floor. I told myself it was animals. Raccoons, maybe, or squirrels that had found a way in through some damaged shingle. But the footsteps didn't sound like animals. They sounded measured, human. The weight and rhythm of someone who couldn't sleep, who walked endless circuits in a confined space, back and forth, back and forth. I pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. When I lowered them, the footsteps had stopped. The obsession grew like mold, slow, insidious, impossible to scrub away. I found myself staring at the ceiling during work, my code forgotten, listening for sounds that didn't come. I walked the house's exterior, studying the roofline, trying to understand the geometry that everyone insisted included an accessible attic. I called the previous owners, got a disconnected number. I checked the property records, found nothing unusual. And I started seeing her, not clearly, never clearly, just movements in my peripheral vision when I looked at the attic window from outside. A shift in the darkness behind the glass. A pale blur that might have been fabric or reflection or nothing at all. The more I looked, the more I saw, until I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what my mind was constructing from shadows and suggestion. I stopped sleeping well. When I did sleep, I dreamed of locked rooms and women who smiled with too many teeth. I'd wake with my heart hammering, convinced I'd heard knocking from above, convinced someone was trying to get out or get in. The neighbors stopped talking to me entirely. I'd see them watching from their windows, curtains twitching closed when I looked their way. Mrs. Chen crossed the street to avoid passing my house. The mailman left my packages at the end of the driveway. I should have left. Should have walked away from the mortgage and the house and the whole cursed situation. But leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. That I was seeing things. That the isolation had finally cracked something fundamental in my mind. That there was no woman, no footsteps, no mystery, just me, alone in an old house, losing my grip on what was real. So instead, I decided to find the attic. I started in the hallways, tapping walls, listening for the hollow sound that would indicate empty space beyond. I pulled back carpets, looking for hidden trapdoors. I measured rooms, comparing their dimensions to the house's exterior, searching for the mathematical proof of missing space. And I found it. The dimensions didn't match. My bedroom was 12 feet wide, but the exterior wall suggested it should be 15. 3 feet of space, unaccounted for. A gap in reality that shouldn't exist, but did. I tore into the wall with a crowbar at 2 in the morning, plaster and dust raining down around me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the tool. The wall was thicker than it should have been, 2 layers with space between, and behind the second layer, I found it. A door. Small, wooden, painted the same color as the wall had been. No handle, just a simple latch. And above it, scratched into the wood in crude letters, "Do not open." My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The house was completely silent around me. No creaks, no settling, nothing. Just me and the door and the warning I was about to ignore. The latch was stiff. Decades of disuse had practically welded it shut. I had to hammer it with the crowbar's edge before it finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked, revealing narrow stairs climbing up into absolute darkness. The smell hit me immediately. Not decay, not animal, but something else. Old perfume, lavender and something underneath it, something wrong that made my throat close, and dust. Decades of it, thick enough to taste. I got a flashlight, climbed. The stairs were steep, the walls pressing close on either side. Cobwebs caught at my face, my hair. My flashlight beam bounced ahead of me, illuminating nothing but more stairs, more darkness, more dust that hung in the air like fog. Then I reached the top. The attic was exactly as I'd imagined, small, low-ceilinged, with exposed beams and insulation hanging in yellowed sheets. The window I'd seen from outside stood at the far end, gray light filtering through grimy glass. And the floor was covered in dust, thick, undisturbed dust, except for the footprints. They led from the top of the stairs to the window and back again. Fresh, recent, the edges still sharp, not yet settled. Bare footprints, small, a woman's size. They paced back and forth, in the same circuit I'd heard night after night above my bed. My flashlight trembled in my hand. The beam swung wildly across the space, catching on something in the corner. A pile of fabric. White. I moved closer, my feet leaving new prints beside the others. It was a dress. Old-fashioned, high-necked, the kind you'd see in photographs from 100 years ago. It lay in a crumpled heap, as if someone had simply stepped out of it and walked away. I reached down to touch it, my fingers inches from the cloth, when I heard it. Behind me, on the stairs. Footsteps, climbing. I spun, my flashlight beam stabbing into the stairwell, illuminating nothing but dust motes swirling in the sudden disturbance of air. The footsteps continued, steady and patient, ascending one step at a time. I backed toward the window, my spine pressing against the glass. Cold seeped through my shirt, through my skin, into my bones. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Nothing appeared, but the dust began to shift. New footprints formed in front of me, appearing one after another in a slow, measured pace, coming toward me. The same small, barefoot prints that already crisscrossed the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as the invisible presence crossed the attic, each print appearing with a soft sound like a sigh, until it stopped directly in front of me. The air grew colder. My breath came out in white clouds, and in the dust-covered window behind me, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. A woman in white, standing where I stood, her face pale and hollow-eyed, her expression sad and angry and hungry all at once. She raised one hand. I saw it in the reflection, transparent as smoke, and pressed it against my chest. I felt the touch. 5 points of ice where her fingers made contact. The sensation of being pushed, of falling, of emptiness opening up inside me like a wound. Then I was on the stairs, stumbling down, the door slamming shut behind me with enough force to shake the walls. I hit the hallway floor hard, my flashlight rolling away, still shining its beam on ordinary things. Walls, carpet, my own shaking hands. I sealed the wall back up that night, plastered it, painted it, pushed furniture against it, anything to hide the door, to pretend it had never been opened, that I'd never climbed those stairs. But I still hear the footsteps, every night, pacing above my bed, back and forth, in a circuit that never ends. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working in my study, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. A reflection in my dark computer screen. A woman in white, standing behind me, watching. I don't turn around anymore. I've learned it's better not to look. Better to pretend I don't see her, don't hear her, don't feel her cold presence settling over my shoulders like a shroud. The neighbors have stopped watching my house. They don't need to anymore. They know she's not in the window, because now she's down here, with me. I tell myself it's not real, that the isolation, the stress, the long hours alone have finally broken something in my mind, that there is no woman, no ghost, no presence sharing my space. Just me, creating elaborate justifications for things that have perfectly rational explanations. But then I see the footprints, fresh ones, appearing in the dust I deliberately leave on my floors now, tracking her movements through my home. I see them leading from room to room, always ending at doorways where I'm standing, as if she's testing boundaries, waiting for permission to cross. And I wonder, have I been documenting a haunting, or have I been documenting my own descent into madness? Is there really a woman in white, or am I the ghost in this house, a presence so disturbed that I've conjured an entire mythology to explain the emptiness inside me? I don't know anymore. I can't tell where she ends and I begin, whether the cold touches are real or imagined, whether the footsteps echo in the attic or just in the hollow spaces of my failing mind. All I know is that every night I lie in bed and feel her weight settling beside me, a coldness that seeps into my bones, and I keep my eyes closed because I'm terrified of what I'll see if I open them. Not that she's there, but that she isn't, that I'm alone, that I've always been alone, that the woman in white is just another name for the thing that lives inside me, the emptiness that wears my face and walks through my house and leaves footprints in the dust that no one else can see. The door to the attic is sealed, but late at night I hear it opening, hear the creak of hinges, the whisper of footsteps on stairs, and I don't know if she's coming down, or if I'm being called back up. Either way, I'm starting to understand that it doesn't matter. The attic was never locked to keep something in. It was locked to keep something out, and I opened it anyway. Now there's nothing left but to wait and see which one of us is really haunting this house. Which one of us is the woman in the window? Which one of us is already gone? Story 5. The first time it happened, I convinced myself I'd simply forgotten. We'd been in the house for 3 days when I walked past the dining room at 7 in the evening and stopped mid-stride. The table was set, 6 places, arranged with meticulous precision, white china plates centered on burgundy placemats, silverware aligned with geometric accuracy, wine glasses positioned exactly 2 inches from the knife tips. The chandelier above cast pools of amber light across the settings, making the crystal gleam like small fires suspended in glass. My wife, Helena, stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel frozen in her hands. Her brother Vincent leaned against the wall behind her, and my own sister, Beatrice, had gone perfectly still on the staircase, one hand gripping the banister. The thing was, none of us had set the table. Helena suggested one of us had done it and forgotten, stress from the move playing tricks with memory. Vincent laughed it off as some quirk of the previous owners. Maybe they'd left a housekeeper's schedule running, someone with a key who still came by out of habit. Beatrice said nothing, but I caught her staring at the two empty chairs at the far end of the table, the ones facing the bay window that overlooked the garden. I wanted to believe any explanation other than the obvious, that the table had arranged itself. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle around us. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows this. Floorboards contracting in the cooling air, pipes expanding, the infrastructure breathing like a living thing. But these sounds felt different. They felt deliberate. Footsteps that stopped just outside our bedroom door. The whisper of fabric against wood. The faint clink of glass touching glass from somewhere below. At 3:47 a.m., I went downstairs. The dining room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the bay window. The table sat empty, the chairs pushed in with that same geometric precision. I ran my fingers along the smooth mahogany surface and found it cold, so cold that my skin stuck slightly when I pulled away. The next evening, I made sure to watch the dining room starting at 6:30. I positioned myself in the adjacent study with the door cracked open, giving me a clear view of the table. Helena was upstairs sorting through boxes. Vincent had gone for a run. Beatrice was reading in the sunroom. At 6:58, the chandelier flickered. Just once, barely noticeable. At 6:59, I felt the air pressure change. My ears popped like I was descending rapidly in an elevator. At exactly 7 p.m., the plates appeared. I don't mean someone walked in and placed them. I mean they materialized. One moment the table was bare, and the next, 6 place settings existed where nothing had been before. The transition happened in the space between heartbeats, faster than my eyes could register but slow enough that I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd witnessed something physically impossible. I must have made a sound, a gasp or a cry, because suddenly Helena was beside me, her hand on my shoulder. She asked what was wrong, and when I pointed at the table, she looked at me with such concern that I understood. She saw the table as it had been before. Empty, bare wood and nothing more. But I could see the plates, the glasses, the silverware arranged with inhuman precision. Vincent arrived home 20 minutes later and headed straight for the dining room, announcing he was starving. He walked right past the set table without acknowledging it, opened the buffet drawer, and began pulling out placemats and dishes. I watched him set the table as if it weren't already set, placing plates directly over the ones I could see, stacking reality on top of impossibility. During dinner, I sat in my usual spot, but I felt the weight of eyes on me from across the table. The two empty chairs seemed to hold a presence, a density to the air above them that bent light in subtle ways. I kept glancing at them, catching movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I looked directly. Helena mentioned I seemed distracted. Vincent asked if I was feeling all right. Beatrice said nothing, but I noticed she'd positioned herself so her back was to those empty chairs, and she hadn't touched her food. After that night, I began documenting everything. I bought a notebook and recorded each evening's events with scientific precision. Time the settings appeared, number of plates, position of each piece, temperature of the room, phase of the moon, anything that might reveal a pattern. Day 5. Table set at exactly 7 p.m., 6 places. 2 chairs at the far end appear slightly pulled out, as if recently occupied. Temperature drops 8 degrees between 6:59 and 7:01. Helena and Vincent see nothing unusual. Beatrice avoids the dining room entirely. Day 8. Settings now include cloth napkins folded into elaborate swan shapes. Wine glasses are filled with a dark red liquid that doesn't quite look like wine. Too thick, too opaque. When I try to touch one, my hand passes through it like mist. The sensation is indescribably cold. Day 12. I can hear them now, soft voices during dinner, coming from the empty chairs. They're speaking too low for me to make out words, but the rhythm suggests conversation, question and answer, statement and reply. Helena asks why I keep staring at nothing. I tell her I'm fine. I'm lying. Day 15. Found photographs in the attic. Previous owners, a couple, Douglas and Miriam Hartwick. They're sitting at our dining table in the photo, glasses raised in a toast. The timestamp on the back reads December 19th, 3 years ago. I researched them online. The articles are vague, mentioning only that they died in the house, circumstances undisclosed, survived by no one. Day 19. The chairs move now. Between 7 and 7:30, they slide in and out at irregular intervals, as if someone is adjusting their position for comfort. The sound of wood scraping against wood sets my teeth on edge. I've started taking my dinner in the kitchen, but I can still hear everything happening in the next room. Day 23. Beatrice finally speaks to me alone. She admits she sees them too. Not the table settings, but the people. A man and a woman, middle-aged, wearing formal dinner attire that seems decades out of style. They sit in those far chairs every evening, eating from invisible plates, drinking from invisible glasses. She says they seem sad. She says they're waiting for something. I want to ask what they're waiting for, but I'm afraid I already know. Day 27. Helena finds my notebook. She reads it while I'm at work, and when I come home, she's arranged an appointment with a doctor. She's using her calm voice, the one reserved for serious situations and bad news. She thinks I'm having a breakdown. Vincent agrees. They've been discussing it, apparently. They think the stress of the move, of selling our old house, of starting over has triggered something. A psychotic episode. Delusions. Hallucinations. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am losing my mind. But then why can Beatrice see them too? Unless she's also cracked. Unless this house is doing something to us, something that drives people slowly into madness until what? Until we end up like Douglas and Miriam Hartwick? Day 31. I skip the doctor's appointment. Instead, I go to the county records office and dig deeper into the house's history. The Hartwicks bought it from an elderly woman named Constance Vale, who died in hospice care, no connection to the property. Before her, the house belonged to a family called Whitmore. Before that, the Chens. Before that, records get fuzzy, but I trace it back 6 owners, 7, 8. I find a pattern. Every 3rd or 4th owner dies in the house. Not always both members of the couple, sometimes just one. Always unclear circumstances. Always the deaths happen after several months of residence, enough time to settle in, to get comfortable, to accept the house's peculiarities as normal. Day 34. I try to convince Helena we need to leave. She refuses. She says we've invested everything in this place, that we can't afford to move again, that my paranoia isn't a valid reason to upend our lives. Vincent takes her side. Beatrice says nothing, but I see the fear in her eyes, the way she started wearing headphones during dinner to drown out sounds only we can hear. Day 38. The place settings have changed. Now there are 8 places set. I recognize 6 of them. The usual arrangements, including the 2 for the Hartwicks. But 2 new settings have appeared on either side of the table, and these are different. The plates are cleaner, newer. The silverware hasn't tarnished. The glasses are empty, waiting to be filled. I know what this means. I know what the house is telling me. Day 41. I haven't slept in 3 days. Every time I close my eyes, I see that table. 8 places, 8 chairs. I see Douglas and Miriam Hartwick sitting in their spots, eternally dining on their last meal, trapped in the moment before whatever happened to them happened. I see the 2 new places, pristine and expectant. I see Beatrice and myself sitting in them. Day 44. Tonight, I'm writing this during dinner. Helena and Vincent are eating in the dining room, having a conversation I can barely hear through the blood rushing in my ears. Beatrice is beside me at the kitchen counter, both of us picking at cold sandwiches, neither of us willing to enter that room. The sun is setting. In 15 minutes, it will be 7 p.m. I've made a decision. After dinner, I'm going to smash every plate, every glass, every piece of china in that dining room. I'm going to break the table itself if I have to. Maybe if I destroy the physical objects, the ritual will end. Maybe the house will release whatever hold it has on us. Or maybe I'll discover that the table can't be broken, that the plates will simply reappear, night after night, adding new places for each person who tries to resist. It's 6:52 now. Beatrice is looking at me. She knows what I'm planning. She's shaking her head slowly, her eyes wide. 6:54. The temperature is dropping. I can see my breath in the kitchen. 6:56. The chandelier in the dining room flickers. Helena calls out, asking if we're joining them. Vincent says something about family dinners being important. Their voices sound distant, distorted, like they're speaking underwater. 6:58. Beatrice grabs my arm. Her fingers are ice cold. She whispers something I don't quite catch, but it sounds like "don't look at the chairs." 6:59. The air pressure changes. My ears pop. The house holds its breath. 7 Bao. I look at the dining room doorway from where I sit. Helena and Vincent are frozen in place, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes glazed and distant. At the table, I can see all 8 place settings now, clear as day, undeniable. Douglas and Miriam Hartwick sit in their chairs, solid and present, wearing the same clothes from the photograph, their faces pale and hollow. And in the 2 new places, the ones with the pristine china and untarnished silver, I see 2 figures beginning to materialize. Faint at first, translucent, but growing more solid with each passing second. One of them looks like Beatrice. The other looks like me. We're sitting at the table, both of us, even though we're also here in the kitchen. The versions at the table are lifting wine glasses, toasting to something I can't hear. They're smiling, but their eyes are empty. Beatrice is crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. She's still holding my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. I want to run. I want to grab her and Helena and Vincent and flee this house, this cursed place that collects residents like specimens, preserving them in amber moments of domestic normalcy. But my legs won't move. My body feels heavy, anchored to this spot by invisible chains. In the dining room, our doppelgangers are eating now. They're using the silverware with perfect etiquette, cutting phantom food, drinking phantom wine. Helena and Vincent begin to move again, resuming their dinner as if nothing is wrong, as if there aren't 6 ghosts sitting at the table with them. Or maybe it's 8 ghosts. Maybe Beatrice and I are the ones who aren't real anymore. Maybe we crossed some threshold without realizing it, and what we think is happening now is just an echo, a memory playing on loop for eternity. The dining room clock chimes 7 times. The sound reverberates through the house, through my bones, through reality itself. When the last chime fades, I look at Beatrice. She looks back at me. In her eyes, I see the question we're both thinking. Are we still alive? Were we ever alive after that first night? How long have we been sitting at that table, trapped in the ritual, while something else walks around wearing our faces? The kitchen clock reads 7:01. In the dining room, all 8 figures continue their meal, trapped in their eternal dinner hour. And I realize with creeping horror that I can't remember what I ate for lunch today. Can't remember the drive home from work. Can't remember anything before sitting down at this kitchen counter with this notebook. I look at my hand holding the pen, and for just a moment, it appears translucent. I can see the counter through my fingers, can see the wood grain beneath my skin. Beatrice sees it too. She opens her mouth to scream, but no sound comes out. In the dining room, our seated selves raise their glasses in a toast. The house exhales. And somewhere, in a version of reality I can no longer reach, I think I hear a door opening. New voices. A new family arriving, carrying boxes, admiring the high ceilings and the ornate chandelier, talking about what a steal the house was, how lucky they were to find it, how they can't wait to have their first dinner in the dining room. Tonight, at 7 o'clock. Story 6. The real estate agent had called it character. That's what people say when a house is old enough to have secrets but not valuable enough to keep them hidden behind fresh paint and careful renovations. I should have known better. I should have listened to the way her voice dropped half an octave when she mentioned the basement, or how she stayed at the top of the stairs while I descended alone, her heels clicking a nervous rhythm on the kitchen floor above. But I was desperate, and the rent was impossibly low for a house this size. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days unpacking boxes in the upper rooms, where afternoon light filtered through tall windows and made everything seem almost cheerful. The house had good bones, people said. Strong foundation. Built in 1887 by someone whose name had been lost to county records and time. I found myself avoiding the basement door, that weathered oak panel in the kitchen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no logical reason for this avoidance. The basement was dry, relatively clean, with stone walls and a packed dirt floor that smelled of clay and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic, something patient. The storm started on the 8th night. I was in bed when the first one rolled in from the west, turning the sky the color of old bruises. Rain hammered the roof with unusual aggression, and the wind made the house creak in ways I hadn't heard before. But it was the sound from below that pulled me from the edge of sleep. A rhythmic groaning, like old wood flexing under pressure. I told myself it was normal. Houses settle. Houses breathe. That's what people say. Except this breathing had a pattern. In and out. In and out. Slow and deliberate. I went downstairs in my boxers and t-shirt, feet cold against the hardwood, then colder still on the kitchen linoleum. The basement door stood closed, but I could hear it now more clearly. That low, sustained sound like air moving through a narrow space. I opened the door and flipped the light switch. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered twice before holding steady, casting everything in weak yellow light. The breathing stopped. I stood there for several minutes, listening to my own heartbeat in my ears, feeling foolish and cold, and somehow certain that I wasn't alone down there. But there was nothing. Just the same stone walls, the same packed earth, the same collection of forgotten things left by previous tenants. A rusted bicycle, cardboard boxes soft with moisture, a wooden chair with 3 legs. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn. The second storm came 3 nights later. This time I was ready, or thought I was. I'd spent the intervening days researching the house, finding nothing but a few property transfers and a black and white photograph from 1923 showing the house much as it looked now, though surrounded by fields instead of the suburban sprawl that had grown up around it. No murders, no tragedies, no convenient explanation for the unease that had started to colonize my thoughts. When the rain began, I was already in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, staring at the basement door. The breathing started almost immediately, louder this time, more insistent. The door itself seemed to expand and contract slightly with each cycle, though I knew this had to be a trick of the light, my tired eyes finding patterns where none existed. I descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. The sound grew louder as I reached the bottom. It was coming from the walls themselves, I realized. The stone blocks that formed the foundation seemed to pulse almost imperceptibly, like the chambers of some vast, slow heart. I approached the nearest wall and placed my palm flat against the cold stone. The surface was warm. Not hot, but distinctly warm in a way that stone in a basement should never be. And there was movement beneath my hand, subtle but unmistakable, like feeling someone's chest rise and fall with each breath. I pulled my hand away and stepped back, my own breathing quick and shallow. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations. Underground springs, settling foundation, temperature differentials, pressure changes from the storm. The rational part of my mind was growing quieter by the day. That's when I heard the first whisper. It wasn't a word, not exactly. More like the shape of language without its substance, a sibilant rushing that could have been wind through cracks in the stone, or could have been something trying to form syllables with organs not designed for speech. I stood frozen in the middle of that pulsing basement, every primitive instinct screaming at me to run, while my stubborn pride kept my feet planted on the packed earth floor. I didn't go down there again for 5 days. But the house wouldn't let me forget. The breathing grew louder with each storm, audible now even from the second floor. I started sleeping with headphones on, white noise at full volume, but I could still feel it, a vibration through the floorboards, through the walls, through the frame of the bed itself. The house was breathing, and I was inside its lungs. My coworkers started commenting on my appearance. I looked tired, they said. Was I sleeping okay? Was everything all right with the new place? I told them everything was fine, and I could hear the lie in my own voice, thin and unconvincing. I started drinking more coffee, then energy drinks, anything to keep the edges sharp when they wanted to blur. But lack of sleep does things to perception. It makes the solid uncertain. It makes the impossible seem merely improbable. On the 13th night, I counted them now, marked them on a calendar like a prisoner marking days. There was no storm, but the breathing came anyway, louder than ever, so loud I could hear it in every room. A slow, wet sound like lungs filled with something thicker than air. I tried to leave, actually grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but stopped with my hand on the knob, because if I left, I would have to admit something was wrong. I would have to admit I was afraid of my own house. I would have to admit that I might be losing my mind. So instead, I went to the basement. The walls were moving visibly now, expanding and contracting by inches, the stone blocks grinding against their mortar with a sound like teeth. The temperature had risen. It was almost tropical down there, humid and close. The whispers were constant now, overlapping, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I couldn't make out words, but I understood the tone. Pleading. Desperate. Urgent. I pressed my ear against the stone, and the whispers resolved into something almost coherent. Let us, they seemed to say. Let us out. Let us breathe. I jerked away, heart hammering, and noticed something I'd missed before. The mortar between the stones was cracking, fine lines spreading like capillaries through pale flesh. And in those cracks, something moved. Something that wasn't shadow or water or any natural thing I could name. Something that pulsed with its own rhythm, independent of the breathing walls. That was 3 weeks ago. I still live here. Where else would I go? Every house has its secrets, its little peculiarities. This one just happens to breathe. The storms come more frequently now, or maybe I'm just more aware of them. The whispers have grown clearer. I can almost make out individual voices, though I've stopped trying to understand what they're saying. Understanding, I think, would be worse than ignorance. The cracks are wider now. I can see into them, though I try not to. There are shapes in there, forms that might once have been familiar but have been compressed and changed by years of pressure and darkness. Sometimes I think I see faces. Sometimes I think I see hands, pressing against the stone from the inside. But the light down there is bad, and my eyes aren't what they used to be, and maybe I'm not seeing anything at all. Last night, during the worst storm yet, I went down to the basement with a sledgehammer. I stood before the wall where the breathing seems strongest, where the whispers are loudest, where something inside is most desperately trying to get out. I raised the hammer. I stood like that for 10 minutes, maybe 15, while the house breathed around me and the voices pleaded and my arms ached with the weight of the decision. I didn't swing. I put the hammer down and went back upstairs. Because here's what I've realized, what's kept me awake these past 3 weeks. If I break the wall, if I let them out, whatever they are, whatever's been sealed in there since 1887 or earlier, then I have to accept that this is real, that the breathing is real, that the voices are real, that I live in a house built on top of something that should have stayed buried. But if I don't break the wall, if I just keep living here, listening to it breathe, feeling it pulse beneath my feet, then I can maintain the fiction that I'm fine, that everything is normal, that I'm not the kind of person who hears voices in the walls. The truth is, I don't know anymore which possibility terrifies me more, that something is actually down there, sealed behind a century of stone and mortar, or that nothing is down there at all, and the breathing, the whispers, the warmth, all of it is just the sound of my own mind coming apart. Tonight there's another storm coming. I can feel it in the pressure behind my eyes, in the electric taste of the air. The house can feel it too. It's already started breathing faster, the walls moving with increased urgency. The whispers are louder, more insistent. They know I'm listening. They know I understand. And I think they know that eventually, whether tonight or tomorrow or next week, I'm going to pick up that hammer again. Because you can only live so long with something sealed inside, breathing and pleading and pressing against its prison walls, before the pressure becomes unbearable, before something has to give. I'm standing at the basement door now, writing this on my phone, because I need someone to know. If they find me down there, if I don't come back up, at least there will be a record. At least someone will understand that I had a choice, and I chose to know, even if knowledge destroys me. The door is warm under my hand. The house is breathing faster now, almost panting. The whispers have resolved into a single word, repeated over and over, and I can finally understand it clearly. Please. I'm opening the door now. I'm descending the stairs. The hammer is in my hand, and I can feel the house holding its breath. Every wall and board and stone waiting for what comes next. And the terrible thing, the thing that keeps me moving forward even as every instinct screams to run, is that I'm not sure anymore whether I'm moving toward the wall to break it open, or whether something behind it is pulling me closer, reeling me in like a fish on a line, patient and hungry, and finally, after all these years, about to be free. The breathing stops. The silence is worse. Story 7. The scraping sound of the putty knife against plaster had become my meditation, my mantra, my slow descent into something I couldn't yet name. We'd been stripping wallpaper from the bedroom walls for 3 days when I first noticed the pattern wasn't quite right. Our contractor, a weathered man named Dmitri, who spoke in half sentences and knew the bones of old houses, had warned us about the layers. The house dated back to 1923, and apparently every decade brought new tenants who simply papered over the past rather than erasing it. He told us we might find 6, maybe 7 layers. He was wrong. We found 13. The outer layers came away easily enough, brittle and yellowed with age, geometric patterns from the 70s, psychedelic swirls from the 60s. But as we worked deeper, the paper grew more stubborn, as if the walls themselves were reluctant to shed their skin. My wife Eleanor worked alongside me those first days, her auburn hair tied back, a smudge of paste dried on her cheek. She hummed while she worked, old folk songs her grandmother had taught her. I remember thinking how the sound echoed strangely in the empty room, bouncing off the stripped walls in a way that made it seem like there were more than 2 of us working. By the 4th day, Eleanor had to return to the city for work. She taught literature at the university, and the spring semester demanded her attention. She kissed me goodbye at dawn, her lips cool against my forehead, and promised to return Friday evening. The house felt different after her car disappeared down the tree-lined drive. Larger, more attentive. I worked alone through the morning, the April sun slanting through windows we'd cleaned just days before. The 11th layer was a Victorian pattern. Elaborate roses intertwined with leaves and thorns, printed in faded burgundy and gold. The detail was extraordinary. Each petal seemed to have depth, each leaf a delicate vein structure that must have cost a fortune to produce. I found myself staring at one particular rose near the ceiling molding, losing track of time and the complexity of its rendering. That's when I noticed the first irregularity. The rose wasn't quite where I remembered it being. I'd been focusing on it all morning, using it as a landmark to pace my work, yet somehow it had shifted 3 inches to the left. I blamed exhaustion. We'd been working 14-hour days, breathing in dust and paste fumes, surviving on coffee and takeout. The mind plays tricks when deprived of sleep, but as I continued scraping, I kept glancing back at that rose, and I swear, though I told myself it was impossible, I saw it move. Not dramatically, just a subtle rotation, the way a flower might turn to follow the sun, except we were indoors. And this was wallpaper. I forced myself to focus on the work. The 11th layer was nearly complete when I reached the 12th, a simpler pattern of intertwining ivy and small white flowers. Nothing remarkable except for how firmly it clung to the plaster. My putty knife skittered across its surface, barely making a dent. I switched to a steamer, filling the room with hot mist that clung to my skin and fogged the windows. The paper finally began to yield, coming away in long, soggy strips that landed at my feet with wet slaps. By the time I finished the 12th layer, darkness had crept across the room, I hadn't noticed the sun setting, hadn't thought to turn on lights. The room glowed with a peculiar twilight that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The 13th layer, the final one, the original paper from 1923, was exposed at last. The pattern stole my breath. Roses again, but different from the 11th layer. These were more organic, less stylized. The burgundy ink had a depth I'd never seen in vintage wallpaper, and the flowers seemed to possess an unsettling realism. In the dim light, they almost appeared three-dimensional. I reached out to touch one and jerked my hand back. The paper was warm, not from the steamer, that had been hours ago. It radiated its own heat, like skin. I should have left the room then, should have closed the door and driven back to the city, to our apartment, to Eleanor and normalcy. Instead, I turned on every light. The harsh illumination from the bare bulb we'd hung from the ceiling fixture made the roses look flat again. Ordinary. Just old wallpaper that needed to come down like all the rest. I ordered Chinese food and ate it standing in the kitchen, staring at my phone without really seeing it. Every few minutes, I'd glance down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door stood open, a rectangle of light in the darkened corridor. Nothing moved within. Still, I found myself reluctant to return. When I finally forced myself back into the room around 11, I immediately saw the change. The largest rose, a bloom positioned at eye level near the window, had rotated. Where before its petals had faced the ceiling, now they angled toward the door, toward me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that made my vision pulse. It's old paper, I told myself. Old adhesive. It's shrinking as it dries, creating an illusion of movement. But my hands shook as I set up the camp bed Eleanor and I had been using. We'd moved it to the hallway after the first night, unable to sleep in the room while stripping it. Now I dragged it back in. Some defiant part of me refused to be driven out by wallpaper, by flowers printed a century ago. I left the light on when I finally lay down around midnight. Sleep felt impossible anyway. I stared at the ceiling, at the play of shadows from the single bulb, and tried to time my breathing to slow my racing pulse. The house settled around me with creaks and groans. Old houses do that. The wood expands and contracts, pipes tick as they cool. Normal sounds, nothing more. I must have dozed eventually, because I woke to darkness. The bulb had burned out, or I'd unconsciously turned it off, or I groped for my phone on the floor beside the bed. The screen's glow was harsh in the absolute blackness. 3:47 a.m. That's when I heard it. A sound like fabric sliding against fabric. A whisper of movement in the dark. I swept my phone's light across the room and the beam caught the wall opposite my bed. The roses were different. Not in their position, though perhaps that too, but in their arrangement. Where before they'd been scattered across the wall in a pleasant random pattern, now they clustered together. Dozens of them, packed tight, creating a rough oval shape. A face shape. My breath caught. I sat up slowly, keeping the light trained on the wall. The longer I stared, the clearer the image became. Two darker roses positioned like eyes. A long, curving stem forming a mouth, turned down in an expression of profound sorrow or screaming rage. I couldn't tell which. The surrounding flowers created the impression of hair, or maybe hands clutching at a face. I scrambled off the bed and hit the light switch. Nothing. The bulb really had burned out. My phone's battery was at 12%. The charger was downstairs in the kitchen, and suddenly the thought of leaving this room, of turning my back on that wall, filled me with a terror so profound I tasted copper. I stood there until dawn, my phone light dimming gradually, watching the face in the flowers. It didn't move again, but I felt its attention on me, absolute and unwavering. When the first gray light finally seeped through the windows, the pattern looked normal again. Random. Just flowers and leaves in burgundy and gold. I told myself I'd imagined it. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. Toast, clouds, tree bark, 100-year-old wallpaper. But my hands still shook as I made coffee, and I couldn't bring myself to go back upstairs until the sun was fully up and the room flooded with rational daylight. The day passed in a haze. I called Eleanor and heard my voice maintain normalcy as I told her about progress on the bedroom, about the Chinese food, about nothing important. She said she missed me. I told her I missed her too, and meant it with a desperation that embarrassed me. When she asked if everything was okay, I lied and said I was just tired. I didn't work on the wallpaper that day. Instead, I researched. The house's history turned out to be surprisingly well documented. Built in 1923 by a banker named Theodore Wren for his wife Constance. They'd lived there together for 7 years before Theodore died in an automobile accident. Constance remained in the house until 1947, when she moved to live with relatives in Ohio. After that, the house changed hands regularly, staying with each new owner for no more than a few years before being sold again. I found a photograph from 1925, a formal portrait of Theodore and Constance standing on the front porch. She wore a high-collared dress and held a bouquet of roses. Her face was beautiful but solemn, her eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that felt accusatory. Theodore stood slightly behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression uncomfortable. There was something off about the photograph, though I couldn't articulate what. An imbalance, a wrongness. That night I slept in the living room downstairs, or tried to. I dozed fitfully on the couch, jerking awake at every sound. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. That sliding, rustling noise from upstairs. The sound of paper moving against plaster. I sat up, my heart in my throat, and stared at the ceiling. Footsteps would have been less terrifying. At least footsteps implied something corporeal, something that could be confronted. This was different. This was the walls themselves stirring, rearranging, watching. I lasted until 4 before I grabbed my keys and drove to the all-night diner 30 miles away. I sat in a booth until dawn, drinking bad coffee and trying to convince myself to call Eleanor and tell her everything. But what would I say? The wallpaper moves at night? She'd think the isolation was getting to me. Or worse, she'd believe me, and then we'd both be afraid. Better to handle this alone. Better to be rational. When I returned to the house around 8, steeling myself to enter, I found I wasn't alone. Dimitri's truck sat in the driveway. He was in the kitchen, making tea from our supplies, looking entirely at home. He glanced up as I entered and seemed to take in my exhausted state with one sweeping look. His words were simple. The house needed time alone with new people. That's how he phrased it. He'd worked on many old places, he said, and some of them had something he called presence. Not ghosts exactly, more like memory. The walls absorbed things. Sometimes they needed to express them. I asked him if he'd seen the bedroom. He shook his head firmly. He never went into the bedrooms when doing initial assessments. That was private space. But he'd felt something in this house the moment he first walked through. That's why he'd warned me about the layers. He'd known there would be many. He left after finishing his tea, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time after his truck disappeared, trying to parse whether his words had comforted me or deepened my dread. Memory in walls, presence in paper. It sounded like the rationalization of a superstitious mind, but it also felt truer than any explanation I'd been telling myself. Eleanor returned that evening as promised, her car pulling up just as the sun dipped below the tree line. I met her outside, suddenly desperate to keep her from entering. I suggested we drive to the nice hotel in the next town, make a weekend of it, leave the house to itself. But she was already heading inside, talking about how much she'd missed the place, how the city felt too cramped now that she'd remembered what it was like to have space. I followed her upstairs, my stomach churning. She walked straight into the bedroom and I braced myself for her reaction. But she just stood there, hands on her hips, surveying our work with satisfaction. She commented on how well I'd done while she was away. Almost finished. The flowers were beautiful. Had I noticed how realistic they looked? I stared at the wall. The roses were exactly where they'd been on the first day. Random, scattered, pretty. No face, no clustering. Just wallpaper. Eleanor moved around the room, chattering about paint colors and furniture placement, completely at ease. I tried to match her energy, but my voice came out flat. She noticed, of course. Asked again if I was feeling well. I blamed fatigue and she accepted it, but I caught her watching me with concern throughout the evening. We set up the camp bed together, laughing about how we were like campers in our own home. Eleanor fell asleep quickly, her breathing evening out into a soft rhythm. I lay rigid beside her, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The house was utterly silent except for Eleanor's breathing and the occasional car passing on the distant road. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the isolation and exhaustion had created a temporary break from reality. Maybe. The sound started around 3. That familiar rustling, but quiet, furtive, like something trying not to wake us. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, too terrified to turn my head toward the wall. Beside me, Eleanor slept on, undisturbed. The sound continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped. In the morning, I checked the wall while Eleanor showered. The roses had moved. Not into a face this time, but into words, or the suggestion of words. The stems and leaves twisted into shapes that could have been letters. I thought I could make out leave, but maybe it was just LVE or VE or nothing at all. Just random shapes I was forcing into meaning because the human mind abhors the absence of pattern. Eleanor wanted to finish the bedroom that day. Together, we could strip the last layer before she had to return to the city Sunday night. I tried to dissuade her, suggested working on another room first, but she was determined. We started after breakfast, our scrapers working in tandem, and I watched with growing nausea as each strip of paper came away. Underneath the roses, we found bare plaster. Not painted, not papered again. Just the original wall, stained with age and marked with pencil lines from the original builders. It should have been a relief. We'd reached the end. The room could finally move forward. But as more of the paper came down, revealing more of the bare wall, I felt an inexplicable sense of loss. And something else. Anger, not mine, coming from somewhere else, emanating from the walls themselves. By late afternoon, only a small section remained, a 2-foot square near the closet door. Eleanor was working on it, humming again, when she suddenly stopped. I looked over to find her staring at something on the plaster beneath the paper. She asked me to come look, her voice strange. Behind the final piece of wallpaper, someone had written directly on the plaster in pencil. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, the letters faded but legible. It was a name, Constance Wren, written over and over, filling the entire space. Constance Wren, Constance Wren, Constance Wren. Hundreds of times, overlapping, the later repetitions pressing so hard the pencil had scored the plaster. Below the names, a single sentence in the same hand. They covered me, but I remember. Eleanor pulled away the last strip of paper, and we both stood staring at the words. She suggested maybe Constance had written it before the wallpaper went up, a kind of time capsule message. But I was thinking about the photograph, about Constance's intense stare, about Theodore's uncomfortable posture, about how the house changed hands so frequently after she left. Eleanor wanted to paint over it immediately. The words disturbed her, though she tried to hide it. But I found myself reluctant. It felt wrong to erase this message after it had been hidden for a century, like a betrayal. I told her we should leave it for the night, make a decision in the morning. She agreed, but I could tell she was uneasy. That night we both heard it. The rustling started earlier, around midnight, loud enough to wake Eleanor. She sat up beside me, her hand finding mine in the dark. The sound wasn't coming from the papered walls. We'd stripped those. It was coming from the bare plaster, from the section with Constance's name. Eleanor turned on her phone's flashlight, and we both looked at the wall. The pencil marks were moving, the letters rearranging themselves. We watched, frozen, as the repeated names swirled and reformed, the graphite somehow liquid, somehow alive. They created new words. Remember me. Remember me. Remember me. Then, He made them cover me. Paper and paper and paper. But I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. Eleanor's grip on my hand was painful. I could feel her trembling. Or maybe I was the one trembling. Or maybe we both were. The letters continued shifting. Faster now, almost frantic. Don't leave me again. Don't cover me again. Please. Please. We didn't sleep that night. We sat on the bed, lights on, watching the wall until dawn. As the sun rose, the writing stilled, settling back into the original repetitive names. Eleanor packed her things. She said she needed to go back to the city, said it wasn't safe here. Something was wrong with this house, this room, and we needed to leave it alone. I walked her to her car and she begged me to come with her, but I couldn't. Some part of me understood, though I couldn't articulate it, that leaving now would be worse than staying. That Constance, or whatever remained of her, absorbed into these walls a century ago, needed something from me, needed to be acknowledged, needed to be remembered. Eleanor drove away crying, and I stood in the driveway long after her car disappeared, wondering if I just made the worst decision of my life. That was 3 days ago. Eleanor calls every few hours begging me to leave. I tell her I will. Soon. Just not yet. The room is nearly finished. Just the closet left to paint. The walls with Constance's writing remain bare. I can't bring myself to cover them. Every night, the letters rearrange. Sometimes they form words. Sometimes just her name, repeated endlessly. Sometimes they create patterns, flowers, faces, scenes I can't quite interpret. Last night, they formed a question. Do you see me? I answered aloud. Yes, I see you. I remember you. You're not forgotten. The writing stilled. For the first time since we uncovered it, the graphite stopped moving, and I felt something, impossible to define, like relief emanating from the walls, like gratitude, or maybe like release. This morning I woke to find new words. Thank you. I can rest now, but I don't know if that's true. Because as I write this, sitting on the camp bed in the full light of day, I've noticed something new. The writing on the wall is beginning to fade, not erasing. Nothing is erasing it. It's sinking deeper into the plaster, becoming part of the wall's foundation rather than its surface. And I realize that's what's been happening all along. Not haunting, not presence, absorption. The walls of this house have been drinking in the people who lived here, layer by layer, paper by paper, Constance first. Then all the others who came after, never staying long because some part of them sensed what was happening, what they were feeding. I should leave. I know I should leave. Eleanor is right. But every day I tell myself I'll go tomorrow. Just one more night. Just need to finish this one last thing. And every night, I feel the walls growing warmer around me, breathing with me, learning me. Yesterday I caught myself writing my name in pencil on the bare plaster beside Constance's. I don't remember deciding to do it. But there it was, in my handwriting. My name, over and over, pressing deep into the wall. This morning, there were more names than I'd written. The wall is helping me remember who I am, making sure I'm not forgotten. Eleanor called an hour ago. She's driving back with her brother. They're going to force me to leave. I tried to explain that I can't, that leaving would be abandonment, that the house needs me to stay, to remember, to become part of its memory. She didn't understand. But that's okay. Once she gets here, once she's in this room again, the walls will explain it better than I can. They'll show her what I've come to understand. That this isn't horror. It's immortality. The house is eternal. The walls remember everyone. Nothing is ever truly gone as long as the house stands, as long as the walls remain. I'm going to hang new wallpaper tonight. Beautiful roses, burgundy and gold. And somewhere in that pattern, if you know how to look, you'll find me. Find Constance. Find everyone who came before. We'll be waiting, watching, remembering. And when you strip away the layers, searching for something beneath, we'll be there to greet you, to thank you, to invite you to stay. Don't worry, it doesn't hurt. The walls are so very, very warm. Story 8. The laughter started on the third night. I remember because I'd finally managed to unpack the last box, the one I'd been avoiding, filled with her things. The house felt emptier after that, if such a thing was possible. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey I didn't want to drink, staring out the window at the garden that stretched into darkness beyond the porch light's reach. That's when I heard it. High and clear, cutting through the silence like wind chimes made of glass. Children's laughter, distant but unmistakable, rising and falling in waves. I stood so quickly the chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh and wrong in the stillness. The laughter continued, seemingly oblivious to my sudden movement. I pressed my face against the cold window glass, breath fogging the pain, but saw nothing except the skeletal shapes of overgrown hedges and the dark silhouettes of neglected rose bushes swaying in the autumn breeze. When I opened the back door, the sound stopped. The garden breathed its night sounds at me. Crickets, the rustle of leaves, the creak of tree branches overhead. Nothing else. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting. The October air bit at my skin through my thin shirt, raising goosebumps along my arms. Eventually I convinced myself it had been the wind, or perhaps some animal I wasn't familiar with. This far from the city, nature made sounds I'd forgotten existed. I went back inside and locked the door. The real estate agent had called the property charmingly secluded. What she'd meant was isolated. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian that had seen better days. Peeling paint, warped floorboards, windows that didn't quite close all the way. But it was cheap, and after the medical bills and the funeral, cheap was all I could afford. Besides, I'd wanted isolation, needed it. The city held too many memories, too many places where I'd see her face in crowds, hear her voice in the rustle of strangers' conversations. Here, there was only silence, except for the laughter. It came again the next night, and the night after that. Always around the same time, just after sunset, when the light turned that particular shade of purple-gray that makes everything look slightly unreal. I'd taken to standing by the window before it started, waiting, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The sound seemed to move through the garden, sometimes near the old swing set I'd discovered buried in the overgrowth, sometimes farther out near the property line where the woods began. I never saw anything. On the 6th day, I decided to explore the garden properly. In daylight, it lost some of its menace, though not all. The property was larger than I'd realized, stretching back a good acre before the forest took over completely. Someone had once cared for it. I could see the ghost of careful planning in the layout, the remnants of stone pathways now cracked and invaded by weeds, the bones of what must have been elaborate flower beds. The swing set I'd glimpsed stood near the center, its chains rust-red and frozen with age, the seats long rotted away. I found the well by accident, nearly stepping into it. Someone had covered it with boards that had rotted through in places, leaving gaps that showed only darkness below. A child could have fallen in easily. I made a mental note to fix it properly, then wondered why I bothered. It wasn't as if anyone came here. The shed at the far end of the property leaned dramatically to one side, its door hanging from a single hinge. Inside, I found the usual detritus of abandoned places, rusted tools, broken clay pots, a bicycle with flat tires. But there, on a shelf near the back, was a cardboard box that looked newer than everything else. Curious, I pulled it down, coughing as dust billowed into my face. Photographs. Dozens of them, black and white, their edges yellowed with age. I carried the box outside where the light was better and began sorting through them. Most showed the house and garden in their prime, the flower beds blooming, the lawn manicured, everything neat and prosperous. Several featured what I assumed was the previous owner, a stern-looking man in a dark suit standing stiffly for the camera. Then I found the one that made my blood turn cold. 5 children stood in a line in front of the swing set, all dressed in clothes from another era, the girls in white dresses, the boys in short pants and suspenders. They weren't smiling. They stared at the camera with expressions that seemed wrong somehow, too solemn, too knowing for their young faces. Behind them, the garden stretched pristine and perfect. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, May 14th, 1952. I flipped through the remaining photos with increasing urgency. The children appeared in several more, playing near the well, standing in the flower beds, sitting on the porch steps. Always with those same serious expressions, those same 2 old eyes. Then the photographs changed. The garden looked the same, but the children were gone. Just the stern man, standing alone, his expression harder now, something haunted in the set of his shoulders. The last photograph showed the garden again, but this time there was something wrong with it. The flowers looked wilted despite the apparent sunshine, and the swing set stood at an odd angle, as if something had struck it with tremendous force. Across the bottom, someone had scrawled in an unsteady hand, "They're still here." My hands trembled as I shoved the photographs back into the box. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations, old family photos, some tragedy that had befallen the property, coincidence. But the part of me that had been listening to phantom laughter every night for a week recognized something else entirely. I went to the local library the next morning, driven by a need to know that I couldn't quite articulate. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a sharper manner, directed me to the microfiche archives when I mentioned the house's address. She watched me thread the first film into the reader with an expression I couldn't quite read. It took me 3 hours to find the article. 5 children missing from Riverside property, read the headline from June 1952. The story beneath was sparse on details but heavy with implication. 5 children, neighbors, friends, no relation to each other, had gone to play at the property one afternoon and simply never came home. An extensive search had been conducted. The well had been drained. The woods had been combed by volunteers. The property owner, a reclusive man whose name I noted matched the one on the deed, had been questioned extensively, but never charged. The children were never found. The story had follow-up articles for weeks, then months, then years. Theories ranged from abduction to accident to something the papers only hinted at. Something darker. The property owner had died in 1954. The articles didn't say how, but reading between the lines suggested it hadn't been from natural causes. The house had stood empty for decades after that, changing hands multiple times, never occupied for long. I should have left then, packed my things, forfeited my deposit, driven back to the city, and found some cramped apartment that didn't come with the weight of unsolved tragedy. But where would I go? What did I have left? The isolation had been the point. The silence. And besides, I told myself, driving back as the sun began its descent, it was just an old mystery. Sad, certainly, but old. The laughter was explainable. Wind, animals, my own mind playing tricks after too much grief and too much solitude. The laughter started earlier that night. I was in the kitchen making dinner, if heating a can of soup counted as making dinner, when I heard it. Still faint, still distant, but now I could hear something I hadn't noticed before. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern. It sounded almost like a game, like the children were chasing each other through the garden, their voices rising and falling as they ran. I could almost track their movement by sound alone. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of overgrown grass and gnarled branches. The laughter continued, and now that I was out here, it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I walked toward the swing set, the flashlight jerking with each step, throwing shadows that moved wrong, that seemed to linger a moment too long after the light passed. The swing set stood empty, its chains motionless despite the breeze that pulled at my clothes. I swept the flashlight across the garden, and for just a moment, less than a second, barely a heartbeat, I thought I saw something. A pale shape near the well, small and quick, there and gone before I could focus on it. The laughter rose in pitch, excited now, and I spun toward the sound, the flashlight beam wild and erratic. Nothing, just darkness, and the skeletal garden and my own ragged breathing. That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers that had been left too long in a vase, crossing that line from fragrant to rotting. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the well, against every instinct screaming at me to go back inside, to lock the doors and pretend I'd never heard anything. I walked toward it. The boards I'd seen during the day were gone. I stopped so abruptly I nearly dropped the flashlight. The well gaped open, a perfect circle of darkness that seemed to swallow my light when I pointed it down into the depths. The stone rim was old, crumbling in places, with dark stains that could have been moss or rust or something else entirely. The smell was stronger here, thick enough to taste. A sound echoed up from below. Not laughter this time, but something softer. Whispers, maybe, or the movement of water, or the wind finding its way through underground passages. I leaned closer, drawn by a compulsion I didn't understand, and for a moment I thought I heard words in that susurrus of sound. Thought I heard my name. The flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed me whole, absolute and suffocating. I stumbled backward, away from the well, my hands outstretched and grasping at nothing. The laughter started again, surrounding me now, no longer distant but close, so close I could feel the breath of it against my skin. Small hands seemed to brush against my clothes, my arms, my face, there and gone too quickly to be sure they were real. I ran. Somehow I found my way back to the house, crashing through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, then checked it twice more to be sure, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break free from my chest. The flashlight had tumbled from my hand somewhere in the garden. Lost in the darkness I couldn't bring myself to venture back into. The laughter had stopped. I stood in the kitchen, shaking, trying to apply reason to what had just happened. The boards over the well had been rotted. They must have finally collapsed. The smell was just decay, organic matter in the depths, nothing sinister. The touches had been branches, brush, my own panic making me feel things that weren't there. And the laughter was... I couldn't finish the thought. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing, watching the windows for movement, listening for sounds that didn't come. Exhaustion pulled at me, but every time I closed my eyes I saw that perfect circle of darkness where the well opened into the earth, felt those small hands touching my skin. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I went back outside. The boards were there, exactly as I'd seen them days before, intact and covering the well completely. I stood staring at them for a long time, the morning dew soaking through my shoes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I'd been so sure, so certain that they'd been gone, that the well had been open. But here they were, solid and real, proving me wrong. I knelt down and touched them, half expecting my hand to pass through an illusion, but they were genuine, weathered wood beneath my fingers. Had I imagined it? In my panic, had I simply not seen them in the darkness? I wanted to believe that, needed to believe it, but I couldn't forget the feel of standing at the edge of that open well, the smell rising from below, the certainty that had gripped me. I went back inside and called the one person I still had contact with. My sister, who'd been trying to reach me for weeks with calls I hadn't returned. She answered on the third ring, her voice sharp with worry that softened when she heard me speak. I told her I was fine, just settling in, just needed time. She asked if I was sleeping, if I was eating. I lied, and said yes to both. When she suggested I come visit, spend some time around people who cared about me, I made vague promises I knew I wouldn't keep. After I hung up, the house felt emptier than ever. The days blurred together after that. I stopped going into the garden, stopped opening the curtains. The laughter came every night without fail, and I learned to tolerate it the way one learns to tolerate a chronic pain, acknowledging its presence without giving it attention. I told myself I was adapting, but I knew I was just waiting. For what, I couldn't say. The photographs haunted me. I'd brought them inside, spread them across the kitchen table, studying them for hours in the deepening twilight. The children's faces became familiar, though I didn't know their names. I noticed details I'd missed before, how in one photo a girl's hand seemed slightly blurred, as if she'd been moving, how in another, a boy's shadow stretched in the wrong direction from where the sun should have been. Small inconsistencies that accumulated into something larger, something wrong. I started to see them when I closed my eyes. The 5 children, standing in a line, watching me with those 2 old eyes. Sometimes in my half-dreams they were moving, playing the games I heard each night, but they never made a sound in my visions. Their mouths would open in silent laughter, their bodies moving through the garden like fish through water, graceful and strange and not quite right. On the 14th night I broke. The laughter came as usual, and this time I didn't try to ignore it. I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one until only a single lamp remained burning in the living room. Then I went to the back door and opened it wide. The garden waited, dark and familiar. I stepped outside without a flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The laughter swirled around me and I walked toward it, no longer afraid. Or perhaps so afraid that fear had inverted into something else entirely. A desperate need to understand, to confirm or deny what my sanity kept insisting couldn't be real. I walked to the swing set and stood beneath its rusted frame. The chains swayed slightly in the breeze, creating a soft metallic rhythm. The laughter seemed closer here, more concentrated, and I closed my eyes and listened. Really listened, for the first time since it had all started. There were 5 distinct voices, each with its own pitch, its own pattern. They rose and fell, playing off each other, creating harmonies that no random sound of nature could produce. And beneath the laughter, almost too soft to hear, were words. I couldn't make them out, but they were there. Syllables forming, sentences taking shape, a conversation happening just beyond my ability to comprehend. When I opened my eyes, they were there. Not solid, not quite translucent, but something in between, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, distorting the air into shapes that suggested forms. 5 small figures, running through the garden in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. One spun near the flower beds that existed only in the old photographs. Another crouched by the well, peering down into depths I couldn't see from where I stood. They moved through each other, and through the physical world with equal ease, playing a game that had no rules I could understand. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. They weren't threatening, they were just there, present in a way that defied explanation but demanded acknowledgement. One of them stopped and turned toward me. The others paused their play and turned as well. 5 pairs of eyes that might have been dark or light or neither, fixed on my face. We stood that way for a moment that stretched like taffy, while the world held its breath. Then they were gone, and the laughter with them. The garden returned to its ordinary darkness, empty except for me in the growing cold. I stood there until my legs ached, waiting for them to come back, but they didn't. Eventually, I went inside, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with the photographs spread before me. "They're still here," the handwriting had said. I picked up the photograph of the 5 children and studied their faces in the harsh kitchen light. They didn't look trapped or suffering. They looked patient, like they were waiting for something or someone. Had they been waiting all these years? And if so, for what? The question kept me awake until dawn painted the windows gray. When I finally slept, I dreamed of my wife, not as she'd been at the end, hollowed by sickness, but as she'd been when we first met. She stood in the garden, the version from the old photographs, perfect and pristine. She turned to look at me and smiled, and behind her I could see the children playing, their laughter silent now, but their joy unmistakable. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. I spent the day in the garden, clearing away years of neglect. I pulled weeds from the flower beds, raked leaves from the pathways, oiled the swing set's chains until they moved freely again. My back screamed in protest, my hands blistered and bled, but I kept working. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, the first time in months I'd done something that wasn't just existing. As the sun began to set, I stood back and surveyed my work. The garden still looked neglected. One day couldn't undo decades, but there was improvement. The bones of what it had been were visible again, the careful planning evident. I imagined it as it must have looked in 1952, full of flowers and life and the laughter of children. That night, I waited by the window for the laughter to start. It didn't come. The garden remained silent through the hours of darkness, and I felt something twist in my chest. Disappointment or relief, I couldn't say which. Maybe both. As the first gray light of dawn crept across the yard, I finally accepted that they were gone. Or had they ever really been there at all? I haven't heard the laughter since. The garden remains silent, and I continue to work on it each day, slowly reclaiming it from the wilderness. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light turns that particular shade of purple-gray, I think I see movement from the corner of my eye. Small figures, the suggestion of play. But when I turn to look directly, there's nothing there. The photographs remain on my kitchen table. I look at them every night before I sleep, studying those 5 solemn faces, wondering. The house feels less empty now, though I still live here alone. The isolation doesn't weigh on me the way it once did. Perhaps I'm going mad. Perhaps grief and solitude have finally broken something in my mind, creating phantoms to populate the emptiness. Or perhaps some things exist in the spaces between what we can see and what we can prove, in the twilight between day and night, between then and now. I don't know which explanation is true, and I'm no longer sure it matters. Last night, I dreamed of the garden again. 5 children played in the restored flower beds while my wife sat on the porch steps, watching them with that smile I'd thought I'd forgotten. When I woke, I found dirt under my fingernails, though I'd washed my hands before bed. The well remains covered. I haven't checked beneath the boards. I think I'm going to stay. Story 9. The realtor never mentioned the stain. I discovered it on my second night in the house, after the boxes were mostly unpacked and the exhaustion of moving had finally caught up with me. The bathroom was dated, avocado green tiles from the 70s, a pedestal sink with rust blooming around the drain, and a clawfoot tub that had probably been elegant once. Now it squatted in the corner like some porcelain creature, its white enamel yellowed with age. The stain was on the bottom, near the drain. Dark, almost black in certain light, spreading out in an irregular pattern that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. I tried to scrub it that first week, used every cleaner under the sink. Bleach, vinegar, those industrial-strength chemicals that burned my eyes and left my hands raw. Nothing touched it. The stain remained, a shadow permanently embedded in the porcelain, like it had seeped into the very grain of the material. The house had been a steal, which should have been my first warning. Victorian architecture, hardwood floors, high ceilings with original crown molding, all for a price that made my friends raise eyebrows when I told them. The previous owner had passed away, and the estate wanted a quick sale. I asked the realtor how the old man had died, trying to sound casual about it. Natural causes, she'd assured me. All paperwork in order, nothing to worry about. Her smile was too bright, too practiced. I convinced myself the stain was just mineral deposits, something from decades of hard water and neglect. Every old house has its quirks, its imperfections. This was mine. I could live with it. The first time I heard the water running, I was 3 weeks into my tenancy. It was past midnight. I'd fallen asleep on the couch watching television. Some documentary about deep-sea creatures that left the screen flickering blue in the darkness. The sound of rushing water pulled me awake. That particular hollow echo of a bathtub filling, amplified by old pipes and empty rooms. My first thought was that I'd left something running, but I knew I hadn't. I hadn't used the bathtub since moving in, preferring the cramped shower stall in the basement bathroom. The sound continued, steady and insistent. I climbed the stairs with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness, each step creaking under my weight. The bathroom door stood ajar, just enough to let a sliver of pale light spill into the hallway. Not electric light, something else, something cold. The tub was filling. Both faucets were wide open, water pouring from the tap with that aggressive force that speaks of full pressure. But it was the color that stopped me in the doorway, my hand frozen on the light switch. The water wasn't clear. It carried a reddish tint, like rust, like old blood diluted and spread thin. It swirled as it filled the tub, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if following some unseen current. I rushed forward and wrenched the faucets closed. My hands were shaking. The water was ice cold, so cold it hurt to touch. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the half-filled tub. Under the overhead light, the water looked clearer, more ordinary, though a faint pink tinge remained visible if I looked at it from certain angles. Old pipes, I told myself. Rust in the system. I'd lived in old houses before. I knew how temperamental the plumbing could be. The faucets must have been loose, must have gradually worked themselves open. These old fixtures, they didn't have the tight seals of modern hardware. It was a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't explain why the water was so cold, or why my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to hover just slightly out of sync with my movements, like there was a delay between what I did and what the glass showed me. I drained the tub and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. It happened again 2 nights later, the same hollow, rushing sound, the same cold water with that rust-colored tint. This time I checked the faucets before going to sleep. They were tight, closed completely. I even took a photo with my phone to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. When I checked the image later, the bathroom looked wrong in the frame, the angles slightly off, as if the camera had captured the room from a perspective I hadn't been standing in. I started researching the house's history. The county records were sparse, digitized only back to the early 90s, but I found references to previous owners, dates of sale, property tax assessments. Nothing unusual jumped out, just a succession of families passing through over the decades. I tried the local library, spending lunch hours scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers, looking for anything connected to my address. It took me 3 weeks to find it. A small article from 1957, buried in the back pages. A woman's name I won't repeat here, though it's burned into my memory now. She'd been found in her home after neighbors noticed her mail piling up. The article was vague about details, using the euphemistic language common to that era's journalism. An accident in the bath. A tragedy. The investigation closed quickly, ruled as death by misadventure. The address was mine. I sat in the library's humming fluorescent light, staring at the grainy reproduction of 60-year-old newsprint, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The article didn't mention the bathtub specifically, but what else could it mean? An accident in the bath. I thought about the stain, about how it resisted every attempt to remove it, about the water that filled the tub unbidden. That night, I wedged a chair under the bathroom doorknob before going to bed. The water ran anyway. I could hear it through the door, that steady rushing sound, and beneath it something else, a kind of gurgling, like someone trying to breathe underwater. I lay in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling and listening. The sound continued for what felt like hours, though my phone's clock showed only 20 minutes passing. When it finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse. In the morning, I found the chair undisturbed, still wedged firmly against the door. But when I pushed it open, the bathroom floor was soaked. Water had somehow seeped out from under the door, spreading across the hardwood in the hallway, though that should have been impossible with the chair blocking the gap. The tub itself was empty, bone dry, with only that persistent stain marking its surface. I started avoiding the upstairs bathroom entirely, using only the basement shower. But the house seemed to notice. Pipes began to rattle in the walls at night, a rhythmic banging that followed no pattern I could discern. The temperature in my bedroom dropped several degrees, enough that I could see my breath fogging in the air even with the heat running. And the smell. There was a smell now. Faint, but pervasive, like standing water and rust and something organic slowly decomposing. My coworkers mentioned I looked tired. One asked if I was feeling all right, noting the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I held my coffee cup. I told them I was fine, just adjusting to the new place. But the lie felt obvious even to me. How could I explain what was happening? That my house was filling a bathtub every night with rust-colored water? That I was too afraid to use my own bathroom? I hired a plumber, made up a story about old pipes and strange noises. He was a thick-necked man with graying temples and the confident air of someone who'd seen everything. He spent 2 hours examining the bathroom, testing faucets, checking pressure, peering into the crawl space beneath the floor. Everything was fine, he told me. Old fixtures, sure, but functioning perfectly. The pipes were solid, no rust, no corrosion. He couldn't explain the noises I described, suggested maybe it was thermal expansion, the house settling, animals in the walls. After he left, I stood in the bathroom and studied the stain again. In the afternoon light slanting through the frosted window, it looked darker than before, as if it had grown, spreading its tendrils across the porcelain. I knelt beside the tub and ran my fingers across its surface. The stain was smooth, seamless with the surrounding enamel, but cold to the touch, so cold it burned. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were faint, barely visible unless you caught them in the right light, but they were definitely there. Long marks scored into the porcelain, clustered near the sides of the tub, the kind of marks that fingernails might make if someone was struggling, trying to pull themselves up from the water. My breath caught. The plumber had been thorough. He would have noticed these, would have mentioned them, unless they hadn't been there an hour ago. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart hammering. The rational part of my mind was screaming explanations. Wear and tear, previous damage I hadn't noticed, tricks of light and shadow, but rationality was becoming harder to hold on to. The house was changing around me, or I was changing, or both. The boundary between what was real and what I feared was real had become dangerously thin. I decided to stay awake that night, to watch, to confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself in the hallway outside the bathroom, armed with a flashlight and my phone, recording video. The camera's red light blinked in the darkness as I sat with my back against the wall, fighting exhaustion. Hours passed. My eyelids grew heavy, my head nodding forward before I jerked awake. It was just past 3 a.m. when the temperature dropped. I felt it before I heard anything, a sudden, violent cold that wrapped around me like something tangible. My breath came out in thick clouds. The walls seemed to contract, the hallway narrowing in ways that defied geometry. And then the sound began. Not water this time, but something worse. A voice, or something like a voice, distorted and wet, forming words I couldn't quite understand. It came from inside the bathroom, muffled by the closed door. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house, but I was frozen, unable to move. The door began to open, slowly, inch by inch, the gap widening to reveal the darkness beyond. No light from my phone's flashlight penetrated that space. It seemed to absorb illumination, creating a void where the bathroom should be. The voice grew clearer. It was calling something, a name maybe, or a plea. The syllables stretched and strange. And beneath it, that gurgling sound, that underwater breathing that shouldn't exist. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking down the stairs or grabbing my keys or getting into my car. The next clear memory I have is sitting in an all-night diner 10 miles away, shaking so hard I couldn't hold my coffee cup, staring at my phone's camera roll. The video I'd recorded showed only static, hour after hour of white noise and digital artifacts, except for one frame, about 3 hours in, where the image cleared just long enough to show the bathroom door, wide open, and something pale inside, pressed against the tub, too distorted to be human but shaped like someone trying to climb out. I didn't go back to the house for 3 days. I stayed in a motel, called in sick to work, tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything, but the stain on my hands wouldn't wash away. A dark mark where I'd touched the bathtub, like the cold had left its brand on my skin. It didn't hurt, didn't itch, just remained there as evidence I couldn't deny. When I finally returned, the house was quiet, peaceful even. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes and golden shafts. Everything looked normal, ordinary, like the home I'd bought weeks ago. I climbed the stairs slowly, pushed open the bathroom door. The tub was full. Crystal clear water, filled precisely to the overflow drain, so still it looked like glass. No rust color, no cold, just water. Ordinary water. I approached carefully, saw my reflection rippling on its surface. And beneath that reflection, distorted by the water's refraction, I saw the stain. It had changed. The irregular pattern had resolved itself into something recognizable. The outline of a hand, fingers splayed, pressed against the bottom of the tub as if pushing up from underneath. I live with it now. I've stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to fix it. Some nights I wake to the sound of water running and I don't go upstairs. Some mornings I find the bathroom floor wet, though the tub is empty. The stain grows larger slowly, almost imperceptibly, adding new details. Another hand, the suggestion of arms, something that might be the curve of a shoulder. My coworkers don't ask anymore if I'm feeling all right. They've learned to avoid my gaze, to step around me in the hallways as if I carry something contagious. Maybe I do. Maybe whatever happened in that bathroom decades ago doesn't just stay in the past. Maybe it seeps into things, into porcelain, into pipes, into the people who live within its reach. Sometimes, late at night, I stand in the bathroom doorway and wonder who I'll see when I look in the mirror. My own reflection grows increasingly unfamiliar, the angles of my face strange, my eyes carrying depths I don't remember having. The water in the tub calls to me, whispers in that wet, distorted voice, and I understand now why the previous owner died of natural causes. How do you explain to a coroner that you simply stopped fighting? The stain is nearly complete now. I can see the face emerging in its dark outline, features becoming clearer each day. Soon I'll know whose death the bathtub remembers, whose drowning it recreates each night with cold water and patient persistence. Or maybe I already know. Maybe I've always known. Maybe that's my face taking shape in the porcelain, and the real question, the one I can't bring myself to ask, is whether the events I remember are things that happened, or things that will happen, or things happening now in some endless loop where cause and effect have lost all meaning. The water is running again. I can hear it from downstairs, that familiar hollow rushing. This time, I think I'll go up. I think I'll finally look into the tub while it fills, face whatever reflection stares back at me from that rust-colored water. Because the alternative, staying down here, pretending, continuing this half-life of avoidance, has become more terrifying than any truth could be. The stain is waiting. It's always been waiting. And I'm so very, very tired of fighting what I can't understand. Story 10. The real estate agent had called it a steal. That should have been my first warning. I moved into the Victorian on Ashwood Lane on a Tuesday in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to surrender their green. The house stood 3 stories tall, its weathered clapboard the color of old bones, windows like dark eyes that seemed to track my movements as I hauled boxes from the rental truck. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet for a Tuesday afternoon, but I chalked it up to the suburban torpor I was seeking after 5 years in the city's relentless noise. The interior smelled of dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. Copper, maybe, or old pennies left too long in a drawer. The previous owner had left in a hurry, according to the agent, some family emergency that required an immediate cross-country move. The furniture remained. Heavy, dark pieces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I should have questioned why someone would abandon an entire household, but the rent was impossibly low, and I was tired of fighting for space in cramped apartments where you could hear your neighbor's every argument through paper-thin walls. That first night, I slept poorly. The house settled around me with groans and creaks, the normal sounds of old wood adjusting to temperature and time, or so I told myself. I woke once, certain I'd heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, but when I checked, there was nothing. Only darkness and the faint smell of that copper scent, stronger now, almost metallic on my tongue. The second night I woke at 3:33. I know the exact time because every clock in the house had stopped. The digital alarm by my bed frozen at 3:33. My watch on the nightstand, its second hand trembling between the 6 and 7, as if trying desperately to move forward but unable to break free. Even my phone, plugged in and fully charged, displayed those numbers with an eerie brightness in the dark room. 3:33 a.m. Then I heard them. Footsteps. They started at the top of the stairs, heavy and deliberate, each step a dull thud against the wooden treads. My bedroom was on the second floor, at the end of the hallway, and I lay frozen in bed, listening as those steps descended with methodical patience. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm never varied, never hesitated. Whoever, or whatever, was descending those stairs knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps reached the landing, paused, then continued down the second flight toward the ground floor. I wanted to move, to get up and look, but my body wouldn't obey. Some primitive part of my brain recognized danger, recognized that whatever was making those sounds was not meant for me to see. A door slammed somewhere below. The sound was violent, final, the kind of impact that rattles windows in their frames. Then came the scream. It was a man's voice, raw with terror and something worse, recognition. The scream of someone who knew exactly what was happening to them, who understood their fate in that final moment. It echoed through the house, bouncing off walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, though it felt like an eternity, before cutting off with an abruptness that was somehow more terrible than the scream itself. Then silence. I lay in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting. For what? I didn't know. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Eventually, I noticed the clocks had resumed their forward march. My phone read 3:41. My watch ticked steadily. The world had started moving again, though I wasn't sure it had ever truly stopped, or if the cessation had occurred only in my perception. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn finally crept through the windows, gray and weak, I went through the house room by room, searching for what? Evidence? Explanation? The door that had slammed? Every door stood open or closed exactly as I'd left them. No signs of disturbance. No trace of whatever had walked those stairs. Over coffee, I convinced myself it had been a dream. A vivid, terrifying dream born of stress and the unfamiliar sounds of a new home. The stopped clocks were simply a coincidence, perhaps an electrical surge, or my own faulty memory. People don't remember dreams accurately, after all. The mind fills in details, creates narrative coherence where none exists. But that night, at 3:33, it happened again. The clocks froze mid-tick. The footsteps began their descent. The door slammed, the scream echoed, the scream, and when the clocks resumed at 3:41, I was sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat, fingernails having carved half-moons into my palms. I started researching the house during the day. Public records showed a long chain of ownership, but something strange. No one had lived here longer than 6 months in the past 15 years. Before that, a family named the Carters had owned it for 60 years, but the records ended abruptly in 2009. I tried to find more information, but it was as if everyone associated with this address had simply erased themselves from public memory. The pattern continued. Every night at 3:33, the ritual repeated itself with clockwork precision. The frozen time, the footsteps, the slam, the scream. I tried staying awake, tried to catch it in the act, but exhaustion always claimed me sometime after midnight. I would jolt awake at 3:33, already hearing the footsteps mid-descent, as if the universe was determined to ensure I experienced it exactly the same way each time. I began to notice other things. Shadows that moved independently of any light source. Cold spots in rooms that should have been warm. That copper smell, growing stronger, most pungent near the stairs. Sometimes I would find myself standing at the top of the staircase with no memory of walking there, looking down into the darkness below, feeling an inexplicable pull to descend, to follow the path of those phantom footsteps. My appearance deteriorated. Dark circles carved themselves beneath my eyes. My hands developed a tremor. I stopped answering calls from friends, stopped going to work, eventually stopped leaving the house at all. What was the point? Everything out there was moving forward, time flowing normally, people living their ordinary lives. But here, in this house, time bent back on itself each night, replaying something that demanded to be witnessed. I set up cameras. Of course I did. What rational person wouldn't? I positioned them at the top and bottom of the stairs in the hallway, pointing at every door on the ground floor. At 3:32, I sat in front of the monitors, determined to finally see what was happening. The clock stopped. The screens went black, all of them simultaneously. I heard the footsteps begin above me. I'd moved my vigil to the first floor and felt them through the floor, vibrations that traveled up through my feet and into my chest. Down the stairs they came, measured and inevitable. The door slammed somewhere behind me. The scream erupted from every direction at once. When the clock started again at 3:41, the camera screens flickered back to life, showing nothing but empty rooms and still hallways. The recordings showed the same. 8 minutes of black screen, then resumption of normal feed. No glitch, no static, just absence, as if those 8 minutes had been excised from reality itself. I found the journal in the wall. It was an accident, really. I'd been examining the wallpaper in the second floor hallway, noticing how it bulged slightly in one spot, and when I pressed it, a section of the wall gave way. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space was a leather-bound book, its pages yellow and brittle. The handwriting was neat, methodical, the entries dated. The author never gave their name, but the dates spanned from 2008 to 2009. The entries started normally enough. Observations about the house, plans for renovation, mundane daily life. But then, 3 months in, the first mention, the clocks stopped last night. All of them. At 3:33, I read with growing horror as the entries documented everything I had experienced. The footsteps, the slam, the scream. The author had tried everything I had tried, staying awake, recording devices, research. They'd discovered what I was now learning. This house was caught in a loop, replaying some terrible event that had occurred here. But not just replaying, drawing in each new occupant, making them part of its eternal repetition. The final entry was dated March 14th, 2009. I understand now. The house needs a witness, someone to hear it, to validate what happened. But I'm so tired, so very tired of watching. Maybe if I just descend the stairs myself, follow the path, open that door, maybe then I can understand. Maybe then I can finally sleep. There were no more entries. I checked the date. March 14th. Today's date. The realization crept over me like ice water. I looked at my hands and saw how thin they'd become, how the tremor had worsened. How long had I been in this house? Weeks? Months? Time felt fluid, unreliable. I'd meant to stay only temporarily, but when had I last spoken to another human being? When had I last seen daylight not filtered through these dusty windows? That night, if it was night, if time meant anything anymore, I waited at the top of the stairs. Not in my room, not cowering behind a closed door, but standing on the landing where the footsteps always began. The house held its breath around me. Somewhere I heard clocks ticking, counting down to the inevitable. 3:33 approached. I felt it before I heard it, the cessation of time, like a heart skipping a beat. The clock stopped, and then, impossible but undeniable, I heard the footsteps begin behind me, above me. They were starting their descent, but I was standing at their origin point. I turned slowly. The stairs leading to the third floor yawned before me, a darker darkness against the dark. And descending toward me, I saw. But did I see anything? Or did I see everything? The boundaries were blurring. Was I watching the footsteps, or was I making them? Was that my hand on the railing, my foot on the tread? The copper smell overwhelmed me, and I realized with creeping certainty that it was blood. Old blood soaked into wood and memory. The footsteps, my footsteps, continued their descent. I moved with them, or they moved through me. Down to the second floor landing, down to the ground floor. My hand, someone's hand, reached for a door. The door to the basement, I realized, though I'd never been down there, had avoided it with instinctive dread. The door opened. Darkness below, stairs descending into nothing. And from that nothing came the scream. My scream. The scream of someone who had reached the bottom and found what waited there. But I didn't scream. Or did I? The sound came from my throat and from the walls and from the past and from the future all at once. The door slammed shut. I slammed it shut. Someone slammed it shut, trapping whatever was below or trapping me above, or both, or neither. The clocks resumed. 3:41 a.m. I stood in the downstairs hallway, my hand still on the door handle. Had I opened it? Had I descended? I was standing here, wasn't I? But I also remembered falling, remembered darkness, remembered. I found myself back in bed with no memory of climbing the stairs. Dawn was coming. Gray light leaked through the windows. Another day was beginning, and I would live through it in the strange fugue state that had become my existence, until night fell again and 3:33 approached. The journal is still hidden in the wall. I've added my own entries now, documenting everything, just as the previous occupant did, just as the one before them must have done, and the one before them, stretching back to whatever original event created this loop. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really moved into this house, or if I've always been here, caught in the amber of 3:33, living and reliving these moments. I look at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and don't always recognize the face staring back. The eyes are wrong, too dark, too hollow, too knowing. Tonight, the clocks will stop again. The footsteps will descend, the door will slam, the scream will echo, and I will experience it or cause it, or remember it, or dream it. The distinctions have ceased to matter. The real estate agent was right about one thing. It really is a steal. This house doesn't just take your rent. It takes your time, your certainty, your sense of self. It steals you piece by piece, moment by moment, until you can't remember if you're the witness or the victim, the living or the echo. I'm writing this at 3:30 a.m. The clocks are still ticking, but I know they'll stop soon. I'm sitting at the top of the stairs waiting. I've been here before. I'll be here again. I am always here, in this moment, in this house, in this endless loop of frozen time. The first clock just stopped. 3:33. I hear footsteps beginning their descent, and I can't tell anymore if they're coming toward me or emanating from me or both. The boundaries are gone now. I am the house, and the house is the event, and the event is eternal. The door is about to slam. I know this. I've always known this. The scream is building in my throat, but I'm not sure if I'm the one screaming, or if I'm listening to myself scream, or if there's any difference anymore. The clocks have stopped, and I'm not certain they'll ever start again. Story 11. The sledgehammer struck the brick face of the old fireplace with a sound that shouldn't have echoed the way it did. I stood there, arms still raised, listening to that hollow reverberation fade into something that felt less like sound and more like a vibration in my chest. The kind of feeling you get standing too close to a subwoofer, except there was no music, just that persistent thrumming that seemed to emanate from somewhere below. My wife had left 3 weeks earlier. The renovation was supposed to be our project together, something to salvage what remained of us. Instead, it became mine alone, a way to fill the hours that stretched between dusk and dawn like pulled taffy, thin and translucent, and impossible to break cleanly. The fireplace had been her idea initially. She wanted it gone, wanted the wall opened up to create more space in the living room. Modern and minimalist, she'd said. The Victorian bones of this house deserved better than to be gutted for the sake of aesthetic trends, I'd argued. But now here I was, carrying out her vision anyway. Perhaps I hoped she'd come back to see it finished. Perhaps I just needed to destroy something. Another swing. More bricks loosened, tumbling forward with that same wrong echo. Dust billowed up, ancient and thick, coating my throat with the taste of old mortar and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and kept swinging. The hole opened wider. My flashlight beam cut through the settling dust and revealed not the back wall of the chimney I'd expected, but darkness. Empty space where there should have been none. I stopped, arm burning from exertion, and peered through the gap I'd created. The beam of light seemed to thin as it penetrated that darkness, as if the space beyond was drinking it in rather than reflecting it back. I could make out stone steps descending, their edges worn smooth by centuries of use. The walls were old brick, older than the fireplace itself, older than the house. A crypt. There was a goddamn crypt under my living room. The Historical Society had never mentioned this. The previous owners, an elderly couple who'd lived here for 40 years, had never said a word. Either they hadn't known, or they'd chosen not to tell. I stood there for a long moment, considering which possibility disturbed me more. The temperature in the room had dropped. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice you've been holding your breath, suddenly and with a small jolt of alarm. My breath was misting in front of me, though it was late August and the air conditioning hadn't been running. I could see condensation forming on the windows, droplets racing down the glass like they were fleeing something. I should have stopped there, called someone. The Historical Society, or the city planning office, or even just a neighbor. Anyone who might have known what this meant, what I should do. Instead, I cleared away more bricks, widening the opening until I could fit through. The steps were steeper than they'd looked. I descended carefully, one hand on the wall to steady myself, the other holding the flashlight. The stone was cold enough to sting my palm, cold enough to feel wet, though it was perfectly dry. The air grew thicker as I went down, pressing against my face like a physical thing. That sweet rot smell intensified, no longer faint but cloying, catching in the back of my throat. The crypt itself was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a vaulted ceiling that arched overhead like clasped hands. Stone shelves lined 3 walls, and on them rested what I'd expected to find. Caskets, 6 of them, simple wooden boxes darkened by age and damp. Brass nameplates glinted in my flashlight beam. I moved closer to read them. The names meant nothing to me. A family, clearly. The same surname repeated across generations, dates spanning from 1847 to 1893. But not my family. Not any name associated with the house's known history. It was as if this room had been deliberately forgotten, sealed away and built over with the intention that no one should ever find it again. I was backing toward the stairs, ready to leave and seal this place back up forever, when I felt it. A touch. Gossamer light. Barely there at all, like a spider's web brushing across the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the crypt. Nothing. Just stone and shadow, and those silent coffins. But the feeling remained, that sensation of fingers trailing across my skin. More insistent now, tracing a line from my nape down between my shoulder blades. I ran. Up the stairs, through the opening, stumbling over the pile of bricks I'd knocked loose. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen with all the lights on, bright fluorescent glare that made my eyes water. My heart hammered against my ribs. The back of my neck still tingled where I'd felt that touch, and when I reached up to rub it away, my hand came back dusty and cold. I told myself it was nothing. Imagination. The power of suggestion combined with the stale air of a sealed room. I was tired, emotionally wrung out, working too hard and sleeping too little. These things happened. The mind played tricks, but I could still feel it. I sealed the opening that night, working by lamplight, mixing mortar and laying brick with hands that shook just slightly. Better to forget this place existed. Better to pretend I'd never broken through that wall at all. By morning, you'd never know there had been a hole there. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Almost. The first time I saw the hands, I was making coffee. 3 days after I'd sealed the crypt, and I'd almost managed to stop thinking about it. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, ordinary and warm. I was pouring water into the machine when movement caught my eye. In the living room, visible through the doorway, the fireplace sat exactly as I'd left it. Sealed, whole, innocent. Except there were fingers emerging from between the bricks. Not breaking through, not forcing their way out, but simply there, as if the bricks were water and the fingers were rising through them. Pale, bone white, impossibly long. They moved slowly, reaching, grasping at air. I watched, frozen, as a whole hand emerged, then another, both groping blindly for purchase on nothing. I blinked. They were gone. The fireplace stood undisturbed, solid brick under morning light. My coffee maker gurgled behind me. A car passed on the street outside. Everything normal, everything sane, except for the image seared into my mind of those grasping, desperate hands. I checked the seal. It was perfect, exactly as I'd left it. No cracks, no gaps, nothing to suggest anything could push through from the other side. I pressed my palm against the brick. Cold, yes, but no colder than it should be. No vibrations, no sounds, nothing but solid masonry under my hand. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. It was too far from the living room, too many walls between me and the fireplace. I needed to see it, to watch it, to confirm that what I'd seen was just a trick of the light or a waking dream, or anything other than what it had appeared to be. I set up camp on the couch, facing the hearth, leaving a single lamp burning through the night. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I dozed and woke and dozed again, always with my eyes drawn to that wall, that sealed opening, that forgotten crypt below. I began to think I'd imagined it all. The hands, the touch on my neck, even the coldness of that underground room. Stress could do strange things to perception. Isolation could make you see things that weren't there. On the 4th night, I woke to find the room freezing. Not cold, freezing, Arctic. My breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air like smoke. The windows were opaque with frost, ice crystals spreading in delicate patterns across the glass. And the fireplace was full of hands, dozens of them, maybe more, all pressed against the brick from the inside, visible as pale impressions against the red-brown stone. They moved ceaselessly, sliding over each other, clutching and reaching and grasping. I could see the individual bones through translucent skin, see the tendons flex as fingers curled and uncurled. Some of the hands were small, delicate. Others were large, knobby-knuckled, ancient. They moved without sound, without rhythm, a silent writhing mass of desperate, seeking fingers. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat there on the couch, blanket clutched to my chest, watching this impossible thing unfold before me. The hands pressed harder, and I swear I could see the brick beginning to bow outward, bulging as if the wall were becoming elastic, pliable. Then one hand broke through. Not through the brick, but through the air itself. It simply materialized in the space above the mantel, fingers spread wide, reaching toward me. The air around it rippled like heat shimmer, and I could see frost forming on its surface, ice crystals spreading across those bone-white fingers. I ran. Again. Out of the living room, up the stairs, into the bathroom where I locked the door and huddled in the bathtub, arms wrapped around my knees, trying to remember how to breathe. Trying to remember what was real and what wasn't, and failing at both. When I finally emerged at dawn, the living room was normal again. Warm. The windows were clear. The fireplace sat solid and undisturbed. No hands, no impressions, no signs that anything had been wrong. But there was frost on the mantel, just a thin line of it, already melting in the growing morning light. But there, real, proof that I hadn't imagined everything. I called a priest, not because I'm religious, I haven't been to church since childhood, but because I didn't know who else to call. How do you explain this to a contractor? To a friend? To anyone who hasn't seen what I've seen? He came that afternoon, an older man with kind eyes and a patient manner that suggested he'd heard stranger things than this. He listened to my story without interruption, nodded at the right places, didn't call me crazy. Then he blessed the house, moving through each room with holy water and prayers, spending extra time at the fireplace. It helped. For a while. 2 days of peace. 2 days where I could almost convince myself it was over, that whatever had been reaching out from that crypt had been put to rest. I even started planning to finish the renovation, to open up the wall properly and seal that underground room with concrete, make it impossible for anyone to find it again. But on the third night, I woke to the sound of scratching. Soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, then louder, persistent, the sound of fingernails dragging across brick, over and over, patient and methodical. I lay there in the darkness, every muscle tense, listening to that maddening scratch, scratch, scratch that seemed to be coming from inside the walls, from under the floor, from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I finally forced myself to turn on the light, I saw them. On the sealed brick face of the fireplace, written in frost that hadn't been there before, were words, crude letters traced by dozens of fingertips, overlapping and desperate. "Let us out, we are forgotten, remember us please." I stared at those words until the frost began to melt, watching them dissolve into water that ran down the brick like tears. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent. But I could feel them now, always, a presence just beyond the edge of perception, watching, waiting, reaching. I tried to leave, packed a bag, got in my car, made it 3 blocks before I had to pull over. The feeling of being pulled back was overwhelming, a physical sensation like a rope tied around my chest, drawing tighter with every foot of distance. When I turned the car around, the pressure eased immediately. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was gone completely. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know, need someone to understand what I've found, what I've unleashed. The renovation company comes tomorrow to finish the work, to tear down the rest of the wall and open up the space like my wife wanted. I haven't told them about the crypt. I don't know how to explain something I barely understand myself. But I know this. Those hands aren't trying to hurt me. They're trying to communicate. They're trying to be remembered by someone, anyone, after decades or centuries of being deliberately forgotten. Someone built a house over their resting place, sealed them away from light and memory in the world of the living, and now they know I'm here. Now they know someone finally sees them. The temperature in the house hasn't risen above 50 degrees in 3 days, no matter how high I set the thermostat. Frost appears on every surface overnight: windows, mirrors, the coffee table, the TV screen. Sometimes it forms words, sometimes just reaching, grasping handprints, dozens of them, overlapping like they're trying to climb out of the cold itself. I don't sleep anymore. Can't. Because every time I close my eyes, I feel them. Those light, gossamer touches on my skin, growing more solid each night. Fingers tracing patterns on my arms, my face, my chest. Sometimes gentle, almost pleading. Sometimes desperate, clutching. They're learning how to touch this world again, and I'm teaching them. Last night, one of them held my hand. Not grabbed, not clutched, just rested there, palm to palm, cold fingers intertwined with mine. I sat there on the couch, staring at this impossible thing, feeling the weight of it, the realness of it. The hand was translucent, barely visible, but I could feel every bone, every tendon, the papery texture of skin that hadn't been touched by sunlight in over a century. And the terrible thing is, I held back. I held that phantom hand in mine and felt something like companionship in that cold grip. Because isn't this what I wanted? Isn't this why I stayed in this house alone? Why I tore down that wall? Why I haven't run screaming to anyone who might actually be able to help? I'm not alone anymore. The workers come at 8 tomorrow morning. They'll knock down the rest of the wall. They'll find the crypt, Call the authorities. Make all of this real and official and explainable. The historical society will come. The bodies will be moved, properly buried, remembered at last. The crypt will be filled in, sealed with concrete, made safe. But I don't think it will matter. Because I can feel them now, even in the morning light, even when the frost melts away and the house warms and everything looks normal. They're here, in the walls, in the air, in the cold spots that appear and disappear throughout the day. Learning, growing stronger, reaching, and I'm starting to wonder if they ever really needed to be let out of the crypt at all. Maybe they just needed someone to know they were there, someone to remember them, someone to break the seal of forgetting that had been built over their grave. Maybe I was never meant to seal it back up. I can hear them now, even as I write this. Not scratching anymore, not desperate, just breathing. Soft exhalations that make the curtains move, though all the windows are closed. The temperature is dropping again. My breath is starting to mist. And on the mantel, frost is forming in patterns I'm beginning to recognize. The reaching fingers, the open palms, the desperate, eternal grasping of those who have been too long forgotten. Tomorrow the workers will come. Tomorrow everything will change. But tonight, I sit here in the cold, and I wait for those hands to reach for me again. And I wonder, have I been trying to understand them, or have they been trying to understand me? Have I been the one watching them, or have they been watching me all along, waiting for someone weak enough, lonely enough, desperate enough to finally see them? The frost is spreading across the floor now, creeping toward me like seeking fingers. The walls are groaning with that same hollow sound I heard when I first broke through. And somewhere below me, in that small stone room where forgotten bodies lie in forgotten coffins, I swear I can hear something moving. Or maybe it's just the house settling. Maybe it's always been just the house settling, and I've been alone here all along, talking to shadows and frost and the cold manifestations of my own unraveling mind. But the hand in mine feels real. The cold feels real. And tomorrow, when they open that wall and find what I found, I wonder if they'll feel it too. Or if by then, I'll be the only one cold enough to touch back. Story 12. The ballroom hadn't been used in 17 years. I discovered this when I found the deed to the Blackwood estate tucked inside my uncle's papers, 3 weeks after his funeral. The property management company seemed almost relieved when I called, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally claim the place. The woman on the phone mentioned the ballroom specifically, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper when she did. "There's still furniture in there," she said, "some items that wouldn't move." I should have paid attention to how she phrased that. The drive up took 4 hours through increasingly dense forest. The estate sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to narrow with each passing mile, trees pressing in from both sides like spectators at a funeral procession. When the house finally appeared through the pines, it looked exactly like something from my uncle's generation would have built. All dark wood and steep gables, windows that caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back in shades of amber and rust. The ballroom occupied the entire eastern wing. I found it after wandering through rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, their shapes suggesting the silhouettes of sleeping animals. The double doors stood slightly ajar, and the smell that drifted out carried notes of old wood and something else, something sweet and rotting, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The piano sat in the exact center of the room. It was a grand, black as obsidian, its surface dulled by dust but otherwise pristine. The bench sat positioned before it, as if someone had just stood up and walked away mid-performance. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The ceiling soared 3 stories above, crossed by exposed beams that cast long shadows across the parquet floor. Crystal chandeliers hung dark and silent, their prisms coated in gray film. I ran my fingers across the keys without pressing down. They were cold, far colder than the ambient temperature of the room. Dust should have covered them, but the surface felt clean, smooth, recently touched. The sensation sent a prickle up my spine that I attributed to the chill. That first night, I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms, having cleared away the sheets and opened the windows to air out decades of stillness. The estate settled around me with the groans and creaks of old houses everywhere. Sounds I told myself were normal, expected, nothing to warrant the unease that kept me hovering at the edge of sleep. At midnight, the piano began to play. The melody drifted up through the floorboards, soft at first, almost gentle. A nocturne, I thought, though I couldn't place the composer. The notes carried a melancholic weight, each one struck with deliberate care, as if the pianist wanted me to hear not just the music but the spaces between the notes, the silence that gave them meaning. I sat up in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was impossible. There was no one else in the house. I'd checked every room before settling in for the night, had tested every door and window. The estate was empty except for me and the furniture and the dust. The music continued, rising and falling in waves of minor chords and diminished sevenths. I forced myself out of bed, each step toward the door requiring a conscious effort of will. The hallway stretched before me, lit only by moonlight filtering through the windows at either end. The piano's voice echoed up from below, drawing me toward the stairs. The ballroom doors stood open wide. I stopped at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to return to my room and pretend I'd imagined it all. But I couldn't move. The piano played on, its melody building in complexity, layers of sound weaving together into something that felt less like music and more like a conversation I couldn't understand. The bench sat empty. I watched for 5 minutes, maybe 10. Watched the keys depress themselves in perfect rhythm. Watched the hammers strike the strings. Watched the whole impossible scene unfold before me. My legs eventually gave out, and I sank to the floor, my back against the door frame, unable to look away and unable to process what I was seeing. The music stopped at exactly 12:15. The final note hung in the air, sustaining longer than any natural decay, then faded into silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. I stayed on the floor until dawn, watching the piano, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. In the morning light, I convinced myself it had been a dream, some trick of exhaustion and an unfamiliar environment. The rational explanations lined up neatly. Old houses made strange sounds. Grief did peculiar things to perception. I'd been under stress. I walked into the ballroom and examined the piano closely, looking for mechanisms, for wires, for any explanation rooted in the physical world. The instrument was exactly what it appeared to be, a piano, old but well maintained, its strings properly tuned, its hammers and dampers in working order. No self-playing mechanism, no electronic components, nothing that would explain what I'd witnessed, or what I thought I'd witnessed. I decided to be rid of it. The moving company I called seemed hesitant when I described the location, but money convinced them. 2 men arrived the following afternoon in a truck large enough to handle the instrument. They were professionals, efficient and quiet, and within an hour they had the piano wrapped and loaded. I watched them drive away, feeling a weight lift from my chest that I hadn't realized was there. That night I slept soundly for the first time since arriving at the estate. I woke to music, the same nocturne, the same melancholic progression, but louder now, insistent. I opened my eyes to darkness and knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, what I would find downstairs. The piano sat in its exact original position. The moving blankets lay folded neatly on the bench, as if someone had carefully unpacked it and wanted me to know they'd taken care in doing so. I stood in the doorway of the ballroom, my phone clutched in one hand, the moving company's number already pulled up on the screen. They insisted they'd delivered it to the warehouse on the other side of town. The dispatcher's voice carried genuine confusion when I told her the piano was back. She promised to send someone to verify, then called back an hour later. The piano was still in their warehouse. She could send me a photo if I wanted proof. I looked at the piano sitting in my ballroom. I looked at the photo on my phone showing an identical instrument in a warehouse across town. The serial numbers matched. Both were real. Both existed. Neither should have been possible. I didn't call the movers back. The music came every night at midnight. and every night it grew louder. The melancholic nocturne gave way to something more complex, more demanding. The tempo increased incrementally, the dynamics pushing from piano to forte, to something beyond what should have been possible from a single instrument. The sound filled the ballroom, spilled into the hallways, climbed the stairs, and seeped under my bedroom door like water. I tried closing the ballroom doors, but they wouldn't stay shut. I'd turn the key in the lock, hear the bolt slide home, walk away, and return to find them standing open. I dragged furniture against them, heavy wardrobes and dressers that took all my strength to move. In the morning, they'd be pushed aside, careful arranged against the walls, and the doors would be open. The piano wanted to be heard. I stopped sleeping. How could I, knowing what waited for me at midnight? I sat in my bedroom with every light on, watching the clock, counting down the minutes. Sometimes I thought I heard it tuning itself in the hours before, small adjustments of pitch that rang out through the empty house. When midnight arrived, the music would begin, and I would press my hands over my ears and count, trying to determine if it lasted longer each night. I thought it did. I was almost certain it did. On the seventh night, I went down to the ballroom at 11:55. If I was losing my mind, I wanted to see it happen. I wanted to watch the exact moment when reality bent and broke. I sat on the floor across from the piano, my back against the wall, and waited. Midnight arrived with the precision of a metronome. The first note rang out, pure and clear, and I watched the key depress. No hands touched it. No mechanism moved it. The hammer struck the string, and the sound resonated through the wooden floor beneath me, through my bones, through something deeper that I didn't have a name for. The music built, measure by measure, climbing towards something I couldn't anticipate. I realized, with a horror that went beyond the supernatural, that the composition was changing. It wasn't repeating the same piece anymore. It was evolving, growing, developing themes and variations that built on everything that had come before. The piano was composing, and then I heard it, woven into the bass notes, barely perceptible beneath the main melody, the rhythm of a heartbeat, not mine. The tempo was slightly off, the intervals between beats irregular in a way that suggested disease or damage. The sound pulsed through the music, growing more prominent as the piece progressed, until it dominated everything else. The piano was playing a heart. I pressed myself harder against the wall, as if I could somehow push through it and escape. The music grew frantic, the heartbeat accelerating, and I understood with terrible clarity that I was listening to someone dying, transformed into sound. Their final moments translated into melody and rhythm, and the mechanical precision of hammers striking strings. The piece climaxed in a crash of discordant notes, the heartbeat stuttering, stumbling, and then silence. The final note decayed naturally this time, fading into the ambient sound of the room, and something else faded with it. A presence I hadn't been aware of lifted, like pressure equalizing after a storm. The ballroom felt emptier than it had before, as if something that had occupied the space was now gone. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to think beyond the terrible revelation of what I'd heard. The piano sat silent and still, looking for all the world like an ordinary instrument, its black surface reflecting the pale moonlight from the windows. But I knew better now. I knew what it wanted. The next morning, I made calls. The property management company, the historical society, anyone who might have records about the estate. I learned that my uncle had been a composer, though not a successful one. He'd spent the last 20 years of his life in this house, working on a single piece he never finished. A requiem, they told me. He'd been obsessed with it, had driven away his friends and family in his single-minded pursuit of its completion. He'd died at his piano, collapsed over the keys in the middle of the night, his heart giving out mid-measure. They'd found him the next morning, his hands still positioned as if ready to continue playing. I asked when this had happened. The woman from the Historical Society checked her records, and when she answered, her voice was soft with something that might have been pity. 17 years ago, to the day. I returned to the ballroom and stood before the piano, The morning light caught the dust motes in the air, transforming them into a constellation of tiny stars that drifted and spun. The instrument sat as it always had, patient, waiting. I understood now. The piano didn't want to be heard. It wanted to be played. It wanted to finish what had been started. My uncle's requiem, his life's work, his final obsession, it lived in the strings and hammers and the polished wood, waiting for someone to complete it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I found myself reaching for the bench, pulling it closer, sitting down. My hands moved to hover over the keys, and I realized I knew what to play. The melody existed in my mind as if it had always been there, each note inevitable, each progression natural. I could hear how it should continue, how it should resolve, how it should end. I pressed down on middle C, and the note rang pure and clear through the ballroom. The piano responded with 3 notes in return, a phrase that completed what I'd started, that urged me forward. My hands moved across the keys, and I played, and the piano played with me, and we were finishing it together, my uncle, and the instrument and I. 3 parts of a composition that had taken 17 years to complete. I don't know how long I played. Time became meaningless, marked only by measures and movements and the steady progression toward resolution. The requiem was beautiful and terrible, and I could feel my uncle in every note, his obsession and his desperation, and his need to create something that would outlast him. When I finally stopped, my hands cramping and my back aching, the sun had set again. The ballroom sat in darkness, and I couldn't remember if I'd been playing for hours or days. The piano was silent now, truly silent, its purpose fulfilled. I stood on shaking legs and walked toward the door, and as I crossed the threshold, I heard it. A single note, soft as a whisper, middle C, the same note I'd started with. I turned back. The lid was closed. The bench was pushed in. The piano looked exactly as it had when I'd first arrived at the estate, as if no one had touched it in years. I left the ballroom and locked the door behind me. This time, when I turned the key, I felt something click into place that had nothing to do with the physical mechanism of the lock. The door would stay closed now. I knew this with the same certainty I'd known everything else about the piano. But late that night, as I lay in bed hovering at the edge of sleep, I heard it. Not from downstairs, not from the ballroom, from somewhere much closer. The sound of a piano playing, soft and distant, like memory made audible. The melody was familiar. The requiem, the piece I'd played, the composition I'd completed. I sat up and realized with dawning horror that the sound wasn't coming from somewhere in the house. It was coming from inside my head. The music continues. Every night at midnight I hear it, each time slightly louder, slightly more insistent. I've noticed my hands moving in my sleep, fingers pressing down on invisible keys, working through passages I don't remember learning. Sometimes I wake to find myself sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands positioned as if at a keyboard, playing in the dark. I tell myself it will fade. I tell myself it's just memory, just the residual effects of an intense experience, just my mind processing trauma in its own peculiar way. But yesterday, I noticed the piano bench in the ballroom had moved. I know because I'd measured its distance from the wall before I locked the door. 36 inches exactly. Now it sits 33 inches away, 3 inches closer. And I can't stop wondering, when it finally reaches the door, what happens then? The music plays on in my head, and I know, with a certainty that terrifies me more than anything I've experienced in this house, that one night soon, I'll walk down to the ballroom at midnight, not because the piano is calling me, but because I want to finish what we started, because the requiem isn't complete. Not yet. There's still one more movement to compose, and I'm the only one left who knows how it ends. Story 13. The realtor never mentioned the stain. I found it 3 days after moving in, when the afternoon light hit the bedroom floor at just the right angle. The hardwood planks bore the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure, arms outstretched, legs slightly bent, as if caught mid-fall or mid-flight. The wood itself was darker there, almost charred. The grain warped and twisted around the edges like something had burned itself into the floor with terrible heat. My first thought was water damage. My second was fire. Neither explanation felt right. The rest of the floor gleamed with a honey-colored patina, well-maintained and carefully restored. Only this shape, this person-sized shadow, disrupted the otherwise pristine surface. I called the landlord that evening. He seemed distracted, his voice crackling through a poor connection. When I described the stain, the line went quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "It's been refinished twice," he finally said. "Won't come out. Previous tenant tried everything. Hell, I tried everything before that." A pause, heavy with something unsaid. Some things just set too deep, you know? I didn't know, but I let it go. The rent was cheap for the neighborhood, and the apartment itself was spacious and bright. A stain on the bedroom floor seemed a small price to pay. That first week I barely noticed it. I arranged my bed to cover most of the shadow, leaving only the outstretched hands visible near the nightstand. During the day I was at work. During the evenings I was unpacking, organizing, trying to make the space feel like home. The shadow existed at the periphery of my awareness, an oddity I'd grown accustomed to dismissing. The dream started on the 8th night. I dreamed of standing in the bedroom, moonlight streaming through the window with an intensity that seemed almost solid. In the dream, I was staring at the floor where the shadow lay, but it was deeper now, three-dimensional, as if the wood had been carved out in the perfect shape of a person. As I watched, the depression filled with darkness that moved like smoke, rising from the depths of the floor itself. I woke with my heart hammering, sheets soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. The bedroom was dark except for a thin slice of light from the street lamp outside. I fumbled for my phone. 3:47 a.m. Something made me look at the floor. The shadow seemed darker than I remembered. That was all. Just darker. I told myself it was the lack of light, the disorientation of waking from a nightmare. I told myself a lot of things that night. The next evening I researched the apartment building. Property records went back decades, but most of the history was mundane. Changes of ownership, minor violations, routine inspections. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained a human-shaped burn mark permanently etched into hardwood. I found one odd detail. A gap in occupancy records. The apartment had sat empty for 14 months 3 years ago. No explanation in the public documents, just a blank space where tenants should have been listed. I noted the dates and moved on, though the information nagged at me with the persistence of a splinter I couldn't quite locate. The weather turned colder. I bought a rug to cover the shadow completely, a thick Persian-style runner that I positioned carefully over the stain. Out of sight, out of mind. That's what I told myself. But I could still feel it there, beneath the fabric and padding. When I walked across the rug, I imagined the floor giving slightly under my feet, as if the wood there was softer, less substantial. Ridiculous, of course. I'd tested it before buying the rug. The floor was solid, the boards firmly nailed. Still, I found myself avoiding that section of the room, walking around it rather than over it. The dreams intensified. Each night, the same scenario with subtle variations. Sometimes I was lying in bed, paralyzed, watching the shadow peel itself from the floor. Sometimes I was standing at the window, seeing the shadow's reflection in the glass before turning to find nothing unusual behind me. Once I dreamed I pulled back the rug to find the shadow gone, leaving only unblemished wood, and I felt such overwhelming dread at its absence that I woke gasping. I started sleeping with the lights on. My brother called during the 3rd week. He wanted to visit, to see the new place. I deflected, claiming I was still settling in, that the apartment was a mess. He laughed and said he didn't care, but I insisted. I needed more time. I didn't tell him that the thought of someone else seeing the shadow, or worse, not seeing it, filled me with an anxiety I couldn't name. On the night of the full moon, though I only realized this later, I woke to find myself standing in the middle of the bedroom. The rug was pushed aside, crumpled against the wall. I had no memory of moving it, no memory of getting out of bed. The moonlight poured through the window with that same unnatural intensity from my dreams, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. And the stain. God, the stain was moving, not rising, not yet, but shifting, darkening, the edges rippling like water disturbed by an unseen current. As I watched, frozen in place, one of the shadow's hands seemed to flex, fingers curling and uncurling against the wood. I stumbled backward, my shin hitting the bed frame hard enough to send pain shooting up my leg. The impact broke whatever spell held me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the floor. The shadow was still, just a stain. The wood was solid beneath it, cool and smooth when I knelt to touch it with trembling fingers. Nothing moved, nothing flexed. I sat there on the floor until dawn, watching, waiting for something that never came. In the morning light, I examined every inch of that floor. The shadow was exactly as it had always been, no deeper, no darker, no different. I measured it, photographed it from multiple angles, even traced its outline with chalk. I needed proof, documentation, something to anchor me to what was real. That day at work, I couldn't focus. My coworker asked if I was feeling all right. I looked tired, he said, stressed. Maybe I should take a few days off, get some rest. I nodded and smiled and said I'd think about it, all while feeling the weight of the shadow pressing against my thoughts like a hand on glass, persistent and patient. I didn't go straight home that evening. Instead, I drove to the library and searched through old newspapers, looking for anything connected to my address. Fire reports, accidents, crimes, anything that might explain a human-shaped burn mark on a bedroom floor. I found it in an article from 4 years ago, buried in the back pages. Resident reported missing from Belmont Avenue apartment. No name, no photo, just a brief mention that someone had vanished from their home, leaving behind no indication of where they'd gone or why. The apartment number matched mine. The article mentioned that authorities found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The person's belongings remained untouched. They had simply disappeared, as if they'd walked out in the middle of the night and never returned. The case remained unsolved, eventually archived with dozens of other missing person reports that led nowhere. But there was something else, a detail mentioned almost as an afterthought. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the apartment on the night of the disappearance. Bright flashes, they said, like lightning but contained, repetitive. Police investigated but found no explanation. The lights were attributed to storm activity, though weather records showed clear skies that night. I sat in the library parking lot, staring at the photocopied article until the words blurred. The dates aligned with the gap in occupancy records. Whatever had happened in that apartment, it had been significant enough to leave the place empty for over a year afterward. The question that haunted me wasn't what had happened. The question was whether it had finished happening. I spent that night in a hotel. I told myself I needed distance, perspective, a good night's sleep in a bed that didn't sit 10 feet from an unexplained burn mark shaped like a human being. I told myself many things, but none of them were quite true. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. I was afraid to be in that apartment on the night of the full moon. The hotel room was generic and clean and blessedly ordinary. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No dreams of shadows pulling themselves from floors. No nightmares of reaching hands and empty eyes. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through thin curtains, I felt almost normal. Almost. I returned to the apartment in the afternoon. Everything was as I'd left it. The rug still pushed aside, the chalk outline still visible on the floor. I'd half expected to find the place ransacked or changed somehow, but it was simply my apartment, my space, my problem to solve or accept. I decided to accept it. What other choice did I have? Move again? Run from a stain on the floor? The rational part of my mind insisted that I'd experienced nothing more than stress-induced hallucinations, dreams bleeding into waking moments, the power of suggestion working on an exhausted mind. The irrational part, the part that had watched shadows move in moonlight, remained unconvinced. I put the rug back in place. I erased the chalk outline. I returned to my routine, or tried to. Work, home, dinner, sleep. Simple patterns, comfortable rhythms. The dreams came less frequently, or perhaps I simply stopped remembering them. Days passed, then a week, then two. I began to relax. The next full moon arrived with the cold clarity of November. I'd been tracking the lunar calendar without quite admitting to myself why. When the day came, I felt a familiar anxiety building in my chest, but I pushed it down. Nothing had happened last time. Not really. Just dreams and paranoia and exhaustion. I would stay home. I would sleep in my own bed. I would prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. I kept the lights on in the bedroom. All of them. The overhead fixture, the bedside lamps, even the closet light with the door cracked open. The room blazed with illumination. Every shadow banished except for the one I couldn't erase. The one burned into the floor beneath the rug. I lay in bed with my phone in hand, reading, scrolling, anything to keep my mind occupied. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2. Nothing unusual, nothing strange, just the quiet of an apartment settling in the night, the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. At 3:47 a.m., the same time I'd woken from my nightmare that first week, the lights went out. All of them, simultaneously. Not a gradual dimming or a blown fuse, but instant, complete darkness. The kind of darkness that feels solid, that presses against your eyes and skin with tangible weight. I didn't move. Couldn't move. My hands gripped the phone so tightly I felt the edges cutting into my palm, but I couldn't make my fingers unlock. Couldn't make them tap the screen to activate the flashlight. In the darkness, I heard it. A sound like fabric sliding across wood. Slow, deliberate, the whisper of something pulling itself across the floor. My eyes adjusted gradually, and that's when I saw the moonlight. It shouldn't have been possible. The angle was wrong, the curtains were drawn, but silver light filled the room anyway, sourceless and cold. And in that light, I saw the rug moving, not being pushed aside, moving as if something beneath it was shifting, reforming, rising. The shape that emerged from under the rug was made of shadow so absolute it seemed to bend the moonlight around it. It stood slowly, joints moving with crackling sounds like ice forming on a winter lake. Where features should have been, a face, hands, the details of a human form, there was only void, an emptiness so complete it hurt to look at directly. It turned toward me. I felt its attention like physical pressure, a weight that made breathing difficult. Then it moved, not walking but gliding, its form rippling and reforming with each impossible step. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. I tried to move. My body refused. I could only watch as it approached the bed, as it reached toward me with hands that were simultaneously there and not there, solid and smoke, real and impossible. Its fingers, if they could be called fingers, stopped inches from my face. I felt cold radiating from them, not the cold of winter, but the cold of absolute absence, the cold of spaces where warmth has never existed and never will. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but directly into my mind, each word a sensation rather than a sound. Where is my body? The question reverberated through my thoughts, shaking loose memories that weren't mine, images of this room, this floor, but different. I saw someone standing where I lay now, their arms outstretched, terror and recognition warring on their face. I saw light, brilliant and terrible, burning without heat, consuming without fire. I saw a moment stretched into eternity, a transformation that was both beginning and ending, creation and destruction. Then I saw myself, lying in bed, staring up at a shadow that leaned over me. And in that moment of double vision, I couldn't tell which perspective was mine. Was I the one in the bed, paralyzed with fear? Or was I the shadow, searching endlessly for something that had been taken, burned away, scattered into the very wood that now held my imprint? The shadow withdrew its hand. The moonlight faded, the darkness lifted, and the bedroom lights flickered back to life, harsh and sudden after the absolute blackness. I was alone. The rug lay smooth and undisturbed, precisely where I'd placed it. The room showed no signs of disturbance. My phone's clock read 3:51 a.m. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt a creeping certainty that something fundamental had changed. Not in the room, but in me. I got out of bed and pulled back the rug. The shadow was still there, burned into the wood, arms outstretched and legs slightly bent. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before, or perhaps something that hadn't been there before. The hands weren't empty. In the shadow's left palm, barely visible in the whorls of darkened wood, was a smaller mark. It took me several minutes of staring, of adjusting angles and light, to recognize what it was. A perfect impression of my phone, right down to the camera lens and buttons. In the right palm, my watch, which I'd taken off and placed on the nightstand before sleeping. I looked at my actual phone in my hand, at my actual watch on my wrist. They were solid, real, exactly as they should be. And yet there they were, burned into the shadow's palms, additions to an image that was supposed to be permanent, unchangeable, set too deep to ever remove. I've stopped trying to understand what's happening. Understanding feels less important now than acceptance. The shadow is part of the apartment, and I am part of the apartment. And maybe, just maybe, the distinction between the two is less clear than I'd like to believe. The next full moon is 3 weeks away. I've stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I've stopped a lot of things, actually. Eating regularly, answering my phone, going to work. My brother left another message yesterday. He's worried. He wants to come by, to check on me, to make sure I'm all right. I won't let him visit. Not because I'm afraid he'll see the shadow. I'm afraid he won't. I'm afraid he'll see only ordinary hardwood, maybe a stain if the light hits it right. Nothing more concerning than an old building with old floors. Because if he doesn't see it, that means the shadow exists only for me. And if the shadow exists only for me, then what does that make me? I spend my days now sitting on the bedroom floor, studying the shape burned into the wood. Sometimes I trace its outline with my fingers, feeling for warmth or cold or anything that might indicate presence. Most times I feel nothing unusual, but occasionally, just occasionally, I swear the wood beneath my touch feels softer, as if the boundary between solid matter and empty space is growing thin. Last night, I lay down beside the shadow, matching my body to its shape as precisely as possible. Arms outstretched, legs slightly bent, face turned toward the window where impossible moonlight waits. I stayed there for hours, wondering if the shadow and I might somehow align, might merge, might finally answer the question of which one of us is real, and which one is just a permanent stain that refuses to fade. When I finally stood, my body aching from the hardwood floor, I looked down and saw something that should have terrified me, should have sent me running from the apartment, from the building, from the entire cursed street. But instead, I felt only a strange sense of rightness, of pieces clicking into place, of questions finally approaching answers, even if those answers don't make sense, can't make sense, shouldn't be possible. The shadow on the floor had changed position. Its arms were no longer outstretched. They were at its sides now, relaxed, as if it had finally stopped reaching for something. And maybe it had. Maybe we both had. I'll be here when the next full moon comes. I'll be here for every full moon after that. I don't have a choice anymore, if I ever did. The shadow is looking for its body, and every day I become more certain that I know exactly where that body is. It's been here all along, standing, breathing, living in the space above a dark impression burned into the floor. The question that keeps me awake now isn't whether the shadow will find what it's searching for. The question is, what happens when it realizes it already has?